I'm not sure if I'm ever going to fully understand what happened that winter at the old cabin in the Colorado Rockies. Afterwards, my wife and I decided to never go back. And that's saying a lot, as it had been in her family for decades. Normally, we'd all look forward to spending a week in the mountains, especially the kids. They'd get to run around in the snow and build snowmen, and just be away from school and chores for a while. But the year we went, when the blizzard hit, I swear something unexplainable happened that still gives me nightmares whenever I let my mind drift back to that cursed place. It all started when my wife Victoria said her dad needed someone to check on the old place. He was getting older, couldn't drive up there much anymore, and his arthritis was getting worse with each passing winter. The plan would be for us, myself, Victoria, and our three children, Isabella, who's 14, Gabriel, who's 11, and Samuel, who's 7, to head up for a long weekend in early February. We'd make sure the pipes weren't frozen, the place was in good shape, clear any dangerous snow accumulation from the roof, that kind of thing. At first, I thought it would be a perfect getaway from the relentless pace of our lives in Seattle. I was looking forward to teaching the kids some winter survival tips, building an igloo or at least a snow fort, showing them how to safely start a fire in the old wood stove. Victoria's father, George, had given us explicit instructions about the cabin's quirks. The main electrical breaker tended to trip if you ran too many appliances at once. The back door sometimes swelled in the humidity and needed a good shoulder to close properly. The ancient furnace made settling noises that could sound like footsteps if you weren't used to it. These seemed like normal old cabin problems. What he didn't mention, and what I learned later he'd been keeping from the family for years, was the darker history of the place. Built in 1962 by Victoria's grandfather, the cabin had seen its share of tragedy. A previous caretaker had died there under mysterious circumstances in the late 70s. A family of hikers had taken shelter there during a storm in the 80s and reported strange occurrences that they never spoke of again in detail. But I knew none of this as we loaded up our SUV with enough supplies for 5 days. Victoria packed extra blankets, knowing the cabin's heating system was unreliable. I brought my toolbox and a battery-powered radio, figuring we might lose power. The kids packed board games, books, and Samuel insisted on bringing his favorite stuffed bear, Mr. Patches. The drive there started pleasantly enough on that gray Friday afternoon. We took Highway 70 west from Seattle, then wound our way up through increasingly remote mountain roads. The kids chatted excitedly in the back seat, playing word games and watching the scenery change from suburban neighborhoods to dense forests of pine and aspen. But as we climbed higher in elevation, the atmosphere began to shift in ways that went beyond the normal mountain weather patterns. The wind really picked up, howling through the trees with an intensity that made them sway and creak ominously. The snowfall started light but grew heavier with each mile, transforming from gentle flakes to thick wet clumps that stuck to the windshield faster than the wipers could clear them. By the time we reached the final turnoff onto the narrow gravel road leading to the cabin, we were basically crawling along in four-wheel drive. The road, which I remembered as well maintained, was now rutted and icy, with snowdrifts that came up to the wheel wells in places. I had to stop twice to dig us out of particularly deep spots, my hands growing numb despite my insulated gloves. The kids had their faces pressed against the car windows, marveling at the giant flakes swirling around us like a living curtain of white. "Dad, it looks like we're inside a snow globe," Isabel exclaimed, and I told them, "Just wait till you're outside. You're going to feel like you're in a whole different world." We all laughed, but even then I noticed how the sound seemed muffled and strange, as if the mountain itself was absorbing our joy. Looking back, it was probably the last genuine laugh we had during the entire trip. The forest around us grew denser and darker as we climbed, the tall pines pressing in on both sides of the narrow road like ancient guards watching our passage. Several times I caught glimpses of what looked like eyes reflecting in our headlights, probably deer or elk, I told myself, though they seemed to be watching us with an intelligence that felt unsettling. When we finally pulled up to the cabin after what felt like hours of treacherous driving, it felt oddly lifeless in a way that went beyond seasonal emptiness. I know that might sound silly. Of course it's lifeless if no one's been there for months, right? But there was something more to it, something that made my chest tighten with an emotion I couldn't quite name. The cabin is a small two-bedroom place with a loft perched on a slight rise near a grove of towering pines. Usually I think it's charming, with its rustic log construction and green metal roof. But in the swirling gray-white of that late afternoon, with shadows stretching long and dark between the trees, the place looked decidedly ominous. The roof was bowed under the weight of accumulated snow. The windows were partially frosted over with ice crystals that looked like spider webs, and the front steps were slick with a layer of ice so thick it looked black. Victoria shivered as we stood looking at the place, and it wasn't just from the cold. "It looks different," she said quietly, and I knew exactly what she meant. The cabin seemed smaller somehow, hunched down against the storm like a frightened animal. The shadows around it appeared too deep, too dark, as if they were pools of something thicker than normal darkness. We hustled carefully inside, our boots crunching on the ice-covered porch boards. The front door, which I remembered as easy to open, stuck stubbornly and required several hard shoves before it finally gave way with a groan that seemed to echo through the empty interior. The air inside was stale and cold, carrying an odd, musty smell that I didn't remember from previous visits. I immediately set about cranking up the little furnace while Victoria found the main electrical panel and started flipping breakers. The kids explored the familiar rooms, their voices echoing strangely in the emptiness. "There's no television up there, just an old radio and a couple of board games stacked on a wooden shelf." Victoria set about making cocoa for the kids on the ancient gas stove, while I dragged in our suitcases and supplies from the car. The first thing that struck me as genuinely wrong happened almost immediately after we'd gotten settled. I noticed that the large wooden cross that had always hung near the fireplace was missing. In its place, where it had hung for as long as anyone could remember, there was now a small dark smudge on the wall, like something had been burned into the wood grain itself. The mark was roughly cross-shaped but twisted, as if the original had been heated until it left a permanent scar. I asked Victoria if her dad had taken the cross down for whatever reason, maybe to clean it or repair it, but she looked genuinely puzzled and worried. "He would never take that down," she said, her voice tight with concern. "You know how devout he is. That cross belonged to his father. It's been there since the cabin was built." When I examined the mark more closely, running my finger over the darkened wood, I felt a strange tingling sensation, like a mild electrical shock. The wood around the mark felt different too, warmer than it should have been and slightly damp, as if something had been seeping through from behind the wall. I found myself reluctant to touch it again, though I couldn't articulate why. It really didn't make sense. Victoria tried calling her father on her cell phone, but we had no signal up here, which was normal. Still, the missing cross felt like more than just an odd coincidence. It felt like a warning we were too naive to understand. That evening, as we tried to settle into our temporary mountain routine, other small things began to feel off. The wind outside wasn't just strong, it seemed to have a pattern to it, a rhythm that sounded almost like whispered conversations. When I mentioned this to Victoria, she admitted she'd noticed it too, but we both tried to laugh it off as our city-dwelling imaginations running wild. The cabin's normal settling sounds seemed louder and more frequent than they should have been. Every few minutes we'd hear what sounded like footsteps in the loft above us, even when all three kids were downstairs. When I'd call up to check on them, they'd all be in the main room, reading or playing quietly. "Must be the house adjusting to having people in it again," I told Victoria, but my voice sounded unconvincing even to myself. Samuel, our youngest, seemed particularly affected by the atmosphere. He kept looking over his shoulder and asking if we'd heard the man walking around upstairs. When we assured him it was just house sounds, he nodded but clutched his stuffed bear tighter and stayed close to Victoria's side. As night fell, the temperature dropped dramatically, and despite the furnace running constantly, the cabin never seemed to get truly warm. We could see our breath in some of the rooms, and ice began forming on the inside edges of the windows. I spent an hour checking for drafts and gaps in the insulation, but found nothing that would account for the persistent chill. That night, the snow kept coming down harder than I'd ever experienced in these mountains. We had dinner, canned soup and sandwiches, as we didn't trust the old oven yet, and sat around playing a card game called Crazy Eights with the kids. The atmosphere was mostly normal, filled with the usual family chatter and gentle arguments about game rules, except for the wind howling outside with an intensity that made the entire structure tremble. The cabin was old, built in the early 60s, but it had always seemed solid. Now, however, the windows began to rattle in their frames with each gust of wind, creating a rhythm that sounded disturbingly like Morse code. The front door, despite being securely locked, creaked and groaned as if someone was testing the handle from outside. Gabriel asked if we could check for leaks around the windows, so I did a thorough circuit around the cabin with a flashlight. The loft area appeared fine, no visible cracks in the windows or obvious air leaks, but I kept getting an intensely uncomfortable feeling in my gut. That uneasy sense you get when you're absolutely certain someone is watching you, but you can't see them anywhere. Several times I spun around quickly, thinking I'd caught movement in my peripheral vision, but found nothing except empty rooms and dancing shadows cast by my flashlight beam. The children's bedtime routine took longer than usual. Isabella and Gabriel both seemed reluctant to go up to the loft, making multiple trips downstairs for forgotten items or glasses of water. Samuel flat out refused to sleep anywhere but on the couch in the main room, claiming his bed felt wrong and that Mr. Patches didn't like it upstairs. Victoria and I eventually agreed to let him stay downstairs, figuring it was just adjustment anxiety to a new environment. Later that night, after we'd all supposedly gone to bed, I lay awake listening to the storm rage outside. Victoria was breathing deeply beside me, finally asleep after tossing and turning for hours. I was just beginning to drift off when I heard the strangest noise, a distant rhythmic banging sound like something heavy and persistent pounding on the walls outside. At first I assumed it was a branch slapping against the cabin in the wind, but as I listened more carefully, I realized the sound had a deliberate quality to it. 3 slow beats, then a pause. 3 more beats, another pause. It was too regular to be random, too purposeful to be caused by wind-blown debris. Along with the banging, I began to hear a different, deeper sound underneath, a low moan or growl that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. It would start as barely audible, then gradually grow louder, then fade away, only to begin again a few minutes later. The sound raised the hair on my arms and neck, triggering some primal fear response that I couldn't rationalize away. I glanced over at Victoria, who was still sleeping deeply, and listened for sounds from the kids. Isabella and Gabriel seemed quiet up in the loft, and Samuel was presumably asleep on the couch. I decided to investigate alone, not wanting to wake anyone unnecessarily or alarm them if it turned out to be nothing. Pulling on my boots and heavy jacket, I grabbed the large flashlight we'd brought and quietly unlocked the front door. The second I stepped outside, the cold hit me like a physical blow. The snow was practically up to my knees, and the wind was ripping across the exposed porch with enough force to make me stagger. But even through the roar of the storm, I could clearly hear that low, rhythmic groaning. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the trees and the cabin walls in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint the source. With my flashlight cutting a weak beam through the swirling snow, I did a careful walk around the entire perimeter of the cabin. I couldn't find any branches that might be hitting the walls, no loose shutters or siding that could account for the banging. No animals or people were visible anywhere, just the endless curtain of falling snow and the dark swaying shapes of the pine trees surrounding us. But near the back of the cabin, on one of the old porch rail posts, I found deep gouges in the wood that made my blood freeze in my veins. They looked exactly like claw marks, but they were far too large and too deep to have been made by any normal mountain wildlife. We don't have bears in this particular area, at least not commonly, and these marks were spaced in a way that I'd never seen from any mountain lion or other predator I was familiar with. The gouges were fresh too. Bright wood showed through where the weathered exterior had been scraped away, and I could see wood shavings scattered in the snow below. Whatever had made these marks had been here recently, possibly even while we were inside having dinner. That was the first real wave of genuine fear I felt, a cold dread that settled in my stomach and refused to leave. I ended up going back inside, carefully locking all the doors and even pushing a couple of the heavy wooden chairs against them, just for my own peace of mind. I told myself I was being ridiculous, overreacting to what was probably just evidence of some large raccoon or maybe a bear passing through weeks ago. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was actively watching us, something that didn't want us here. I checked on Samuel, who was sleeping peacefully on the couch, and listened at the bottom of the loft stairs. The older kids seemed to be resting quietly. Victoria hadn't stirred when I came back in. I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, that my city-dweller nerves were just getting the better of me in an unfamiliar environment. The next morning, I told Victoria about the strange sounds and the claw marks. She looked genuinely worried, her face pale in the gray morning light filtering through the frost-covered windows. "My dad never mentioned anything like that," she said, then tried to lighten the mood by adding, "Maybe what you heard was just the ghost of some old mountain man." But even as she smiled, I could tell she was deeply concerned. We spent most of that day trying to maintain normalcy, focusing on practical tasks. I shoveled snow away from the front door and cleared a path to where we'd parked the car, while Victoria organized our supplies and checked the cabin's emergency equipment. The kids built an impressive snowman in the small clearing in front of the cabin, their laughter echoing off the surrounding trees. I tried to bury my worries in routine maintenance tasks, stoking the fire, checking that the generator still worked, testing the backup propane tanks. I'd almost managed to convince myself that the claw marks could have been from some large raccoon, or maybe even a bear that had wandered through months ago, before the heavy snows came. But as the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere in the cabin began to feel increasingly oppressive. The temperature outside continued to drop, and despite our best efforts to keep the interior warm, a persistent chill seemed to seep through the walls. The kids complained of being cold even when they were bundled in multiple layers and sitting directly in front of the fireplace. More disturbing were the sounds that began to occur with increasing frequency throughout the day. Footsteps in empty rooms, doors that we'd left open mysteriously closing by themselves, the occasional creak from the loft that sounded exactly like someone walking across the floorboards, even when we could see all three children downstairs. Victoria and I began exchanging meaningful glances, the kind of wordless communication that married couples develop over years together. We were both feeling it, this growing sense that we were not alone in the cabin, that something else was sharing the space with us. But neither of us wanted to voice these fears in front of the children. Samuel, however, seemed most attuned to whatever was wrong. He refused to play alone in any room, insisted on having someone with him even when he went to the bathroom, and kept asking about the walking sounds that he heard coming from the walls themselves. When we asked him to describe what he meant, he said it sounded like someone was walking around inside the walls, between the rooms, going places that people weren't supposed to go. That evening, the real terror started in earnest. We were sitting around the main room after dinner, Victoria reading by the fireplace while I helped Gabriel with a jigsaw puzzle, and Isabella played a card game with Samuel. The atmosphere felt almost normal for the first time since we'd arrived, and I was beginning to think maybe we'd all just been on edge from the stress of the drive and the intensity of the storm. Then the lights began to flicker. Not just a brief dimming, but a deliberate on-off pattern that seemed to have intention behind it. That's not necessarily unusual for a cabin in the mountains during a snowstorm. Power fluctuations are common when trees fall on lines or transformers get overwhelmed. So I got up to check the circuit breaker panel, assuming we'd find a simple electrical problem. But every single breaker was in the correct position. No tripped switches, no signs of electrical problems. The main power line coming into the cabin appeared to be functioning normally, yet the lights continued their erratic flickering, creating an unsettling strobe effect that made the shadows in the room appear to dance and shift in unnatural ways. Right then, while I was still puzzling over the electrical issue, we heard a tremendous crash from the loft above us. The sound was so loud and sudden that Samuel screamed and dropped his cards, and even Isabella jumped to her feet in alarm. The kids shouted down that something had fallen, so I rushed up the narrow stairs to investigate. The scene that greeted me in the loft made no sense whatsoever. A heavy wooden shelf that had been securely mounted to the wall had somehow toppled completely off its brackets, scattering family photos, decorative knickknacks, and small keepsakes across the floor. Isabella was standing in the corner, visibly shaken, while Gabriel was helping Samuel pick up the scattered items. "It just fell," Isabella said, her voice trembling. "We were just sitting here talking, and it just came off the wall, like someone pushed it really hard from behind." I examined the wall brackets carefully. They weren't broken, bent, or loose. The screws were still tightly embedded in the solid log wall. There was no structural reason for the shelf to have failed, no vibration or settling that could account for such a sudden, complete collapse. The shelf itself was undamaged. It had simply been forcibly separated from brackets that should have held it securely in place. We cleaned up the scattered items, trying to keep the mood light and reassure the kids that it was probably just the cabin settling in the cold weather. But there was a tension that none of us could ignore, a feeling that the incident had been deliberate rather than accidental. The children huddled closer together on their makeshift beds, and I noticed they kept glancing nervously at the now empty wall where the shelf had been. Later, around 11 o'clock, after the kids had finally settled down for the night, Victoria and I were sitting quietly in the main room. She was trying to read by the flickering firelight, and I was flipping through an old magazine we'd found in the cabin, when the radio suddenly burst to life with deafening static. The sound was so sudden and loud that I nearly fell off my chair, and Victoria leaped to her feet, staring at the old radio as if it had transformed into something threatening. The volume was turned up to maximum, filling the entire cabin with harsh crackling noise that seemed to echo off every surface. I rushed over to the radio, fumbling with the volume knob and the power switch. But here's what made it truly terrifying. The radio wasn't plugged in. We had specifically unplugged that particular outlet earlier in the day to conserve electricity, and the cord was lying on the floor beside the table. Yet somehow the radio was receiving power and broadcasting that awful static at full volume. For just a moment, as I struggled to find the volume control in the flickering firelight, I swear I heard a voice cutting through the static. Not words exactly, but something that sounded like urgent whispering, like someone trying to communicate through the electronic interference. The sound made the hair on my arm stand on end and sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the cabin's temperature. I finally managed to silence the radio by pulling the power cord completely away from the wall. But even then, it continued to crackle softly for another 10 or 15 seconds before finally going completely dead. The silence that followed felt almost more ominous than the static had been. Victoria was staring at me with wide, frightened eyes. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. It sounded like someone was trying to tell us something, like they were saying leave or get out. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak immediately. I had heard it too, and the voice had carried an urgency and desperation that suggested we were in immediate danger. Not even an hour later, our worst fears were confirmed in the most terrifying way possible. We heard a scream from the loft, not just a startled shout, but a genuine scream of absolute terror that made both Victoria and me spring to our feet and rush toward the stairs. We found all three children huddled together at the far end of the loft, pressed against the wall and pointing toward the corner near the stairs. Isabella was crying, Gabriel's face was completely drained of color, and Samuel was buried under his blankets with only his eyes visible, wide with fear. "There was someone there," Isabella stammered, her voice shaking so badly we could barely understand her. "A person, but not normal. They were tall and thin and just standing there watching us. When we screamed, they just disappeared, like they melted into the shadows." Gabriel nodded frantically. It wasn't like a person walking away. They were there, and then they weren't, like they just became part of the darkness in the corner. I grabbed the flashlight and thoroughly searched every inch of the loft, looking behind furniture, checking the small storage spaces, examining the windows for any signs of entry. But that corner was completely empty, and there was no way anyone could have entered or exited the loft without using the stairs, which we would have seen. The children were too frightened to stay upstairs alone, so we all decided to sleep together in the main room downstairs. I moved the couch and chairs to create a more open space, and we piled every blanket and pillow we could find into a makeshift campsite near the fireplace. Victoria and I took turns staying awake, sitting up and watching the room while the other dozed fitfully. Around 3 in the morning, during my watch, I heard the banging again. But this time it wasn't coming from outside the cabin. It was definitely coming from inside the walls, as if someone was walking around in the spaces between the rooms, moving through areas where no human could possibly fit. The sound would start in one wall, then gradually move along the length of the room, then shift to an adjacent wall as if something was systematically exploring the interior structure of the cabin. Sometimes it sounded like footsteps, other times like dragging or scraping, as if something heavy was being pulled across the wooden framework inside the walls. I got up with my flashlight and quietly made my way through the cabin, trying to follow the sounds. Every few minutes I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, a dark shape that seemed to flow rather than walk, always just at the edge of my vision, and always gone when I turned to look directly at it. Twice I even spun around quickly with the flashlight beam, certain I'd catch sight of whatever was sharing the cabin with us, only to find nothing but empty rooms and normal shadows. But the sense of being observed never left me. If anything, it grew stronger, as if our invisible visitor was becoming bolder, more comfortable with our presence. The psychological pressure was becoming unbearable. My stomach was constantly twisted with anxiety, my heart rate elevated, my hands shaking slightly from the constant state of alertness. Victoria was experiencing the same symptoms. We were both operating on pure adrenaline and fear. But it was the effect on the children that finally convinced me we had to leave. Samuel had stopped talking except in whispers and only when directly questioned. Isabella was jumpy and fearful, starting at every small sound. Gabriel was trying to be brave, but I could see the strain in his face, the dark circles under his eyes from lack of sleep. Whatever was in that cabin with us, whether supernatural entity, psychological manifestation, or something else entirely, it was having a profound and negative effect on my family's well-being. The rational part of my mind kept trying to find logical explanations, but the protective father in me knew that we were in a situation that could become genuinely dangerous. Finally, sometime just before dawn on our third day, when the storm showed the first signs of easing, I made the decision that probably saved our sanity, if not our lives. I woke Victoria quietly and told her we were leaving immediately. She didn't argue. If anything, she looked relieved that I'd finally voiced what we were both thinking. We roused the children and explained that we were going to pack up and head home early because of the weather conditions. They were all too eager to leave, and for the first time in days, I saw genuine smiles on their faces. Even Samuel emerged from his frightened silence to ask if we could go home now and never come back. We gathered our belongings in record time, throwing everything into suitcases and bags with none of the careful organization we'd used when packing. The atmosphere in the cabin felt different as we prepared to leave, heavier somehow, as if whatever presence we'd been sharing the space with was aware of our intentions and was not pleased. The wind had died down enough that driving was feasible, even if it meant tackling some treacherous mountain roads. We loaded the car quickly, everyone eager to get away from the cabin and back to the safety of civilization. As I carried the last bag to the car, I made the mistake of looking back at the cabin one final time. Standing in the front window, clearly visible in the gray morning light, was a tall, thin figure. It appeared to be human in general shape but wrong in every detail, too tall, too angular, with limbs that seemed slightly too long for its body. Most disturbing were its eyes, which seemed to glow with their own light, reflecting the dawn like an animal's eyes, but with an intelligence that was unmistakably aware and hostile. The figure didn't move, didn't gesture, didn't try to follow us. It simply stood there watching as we loaded our car and prepared to leave, its glowing eyes tracking our movements with predatory attention. I slammed the car door shut without saying anything to the family about what I'd seen, my heart racing and my hands trembling as I started the engine. We barely made it down the mountain, sliding around on the icy roads and navigating through snowdrifts that had grown even deeper overnight. But I felt an immense sense of relief once we reached the main highway and put some distance between us and that cursed place. The kids seemed to relax visibly as the miles passed, and by the time we reached the outskirts of Seattle, the oppressive atmosphere that had surrounded us for 3 days was finally beginning to lift. Later, when we'd had time to process what had happened, Victoria and I told her father about the strange events: the missing cross, the electrical problems, the shelf collapse, the radio incident, the banging in the walls, the figure the children had seen, and my final glimpse of something standing in the window. He listened quietly, his face growing paler with each detail, his hands developing a noticeable tremor. He never said he believed us outright, but I could see the recognition in his eyes, as if our story was confirming fears he'd harbored for years. Eventually, he admitted that his own father had experienced something evil in the cabin decades earlier, something that had made the old man reluctant to spend time there alone. It's been several years now since that terrifying weekend, and we haven't returned to the cabin, not even for a day trip. The kids don't ask about it anymore, though I sometimes catch them looking thoughtful when we drive past the turnoff to that mountain road. We've found other places to vacation, other mountains to explore, but none of us has forgotten what we experienced in that isolated cabin. I still wonder sometimes about the true nature of what we encountered. Was it some kind of residual energy from past tragedies, a psychological manifestation brought on by isolation and stress? Or was there actually something malevolent inhabiting that remote mountain cabin, something that fed on fear and wanted living people to leave its territory? The rational part of my mind continues to search for logical explanations: carbon monoxide poisoning from the old furnace, infrasound from the wind causing hallucinations, mass hysteria triggered by the stress of the storm. But every time I recall that final moment, seeing that impossibly tall figure standing motionless in the window, I know that some experiences transcend rational explanation. Whatever we encountered in that cabin was real, at least in terms of its effect on our family. It wanted us gone, and it got what it wanted. As far as I'm concerned, that cabin can remain empty forever. The mountain can keep its secrets, and we'll find our peace elsewhere. I hope anyone else who might consider staying there is better prepared than we were for what they might find lurking in the darkness between the walls. Because once you've experienced something like that, once you've felt the presence of something that exists outside normal human understanding, your sense of safety in the world is never quite the same again. Some places are simply not meant for the living, and that cabin high in the Colorado Rockies is definitely one of them. May God protect anyone who doesn't heed this warning. I'm not exactly sure what me and a few friends experienced fully that October weekend in 2019, but there was definitely something deeply unsettling about our encounter. Something that still makes my hands shake when I think about it too long. This story takes place during the fall of 2019, when I was 17 years old. Our Boy Scout troop had planned a cabin campout at a remote location deep in the pine forests of northern Michigan, far from any main roads or cell phone towers. The moment our convoy of vehicles pulled up to the weathered log cabin, I felt an odd sensation settle in my stomach. The structure looked like it had been abandoned for months, with peeling paint on the shutters and a sagging front porch that groaned under the weight of fallen branches. The surrounding woods pressed in close on all sides, creating a claustrophobic feeling that made the clearing feel smaller than it actually was. Ancient pine trees towered overhead, their branches so thick they blocked out most of the late afternoon sunlight, casting everything in an eerie twilight, even though it was only 4 o'clock. Our troop leader, Mr. Rodriguez, a gruff man in his 50s with calloused hands and permanent stubble, gathered us around as we unloaded our gear from the trailers. "Listen up, boys," he called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "This place is pretty isolated, so stick to the main paths and don't wander off alone. The nearest ranger station is 20 miles away, and cell service is non-existent out here." As we hauled our duffel bags and sleeping bags toward the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being observed. Every few steps, I found myself glancing over my shoulder at the tree line, searching for movement among the shadows. The other scouts seemed excited about our wilderness adventure, chattering loudly about the games they'd brought and the s'mores we'd make later, but their voices sounded muted and strange in the oppressive atmosphere of the forest. Inside the cabin, the musty smell of old wood and damp fabric hit us immediately. The main room featured a stone fireplace blackened with years of use, and mounted deer heads stared down at us with glassy eyes that seemed to follow our movements. My friend Camden and I claimed a small bedroom near the back of the cabin, close to one of the few electrical outlets available. The room felt cramped with its low ceiling and single grimy window that looked out into the darkening woods. As we unpacked our belongings, Camden pulled out his phone and frowned at the screen. "No signal at all," he muttered, holding it up toward the window. "Not even one bar." The isolation suddenly felt more real, more complete. We were truly cut off from the outside world, surrounded by miles of empty forest with no way to call for help if something went wrong. The first evening passed without major incident, though I found myself constantly aware of the sounds outside our windows. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made me tense up, and I noticed several other scouts glancing nervously toward the doors whenever the wind picked up. We played cards by lamplight and roasted hot dogs over the fireplace, but underneath the forced normalcy, there was an undercurrent of unease that none of us wanted to acknowledge out loud. The next morning brought a thick fog that clung to the ground like smoke, reducing visibility to just a few yards in any direction. When I stepped outside to use the primitive outhouse behind the cabin, the mist swirled around my legs and made the familiar landscape look alien and threatening. The silence was absolute. No bird songs, no insect buzzing, nothing but the soft whisper of my footsteps on the damp pine needles. We spent most of the morning inside the cabin, playing card games and taking turns on the GameCube that one of the younger scouts had brought along. Someone had also packed a portable projector, which we set up in the main room to play movies on a white sheet hung across one wall. The artificial entertainment helped distract us from the oppressive atmosphere outside, but every so often, one of us would glance toward the windows, where the fog pressed against the glass like searching fingers. Camden and I had become close friends over the past 2 years in scouting, bonding over our shared love of horror movies and video games. He was smaller than me, with sandy hair and quick reflexes, while I had always been the biggest kid in our group, a fact that usually meant I got stuck with the heavy lifting. Today was no exception when Mr. Rodriguez announced that we were running low on drinking water. "The pump house is about a mile down the main trail," he explained, pointing through the window toward a barely visible path that disappeared into the fog. "Someone needs to take these 5-gallon jugs down there and fill them up." He gestured toward 3 large plastic containers stacked near the door. "It's not a difficult walk, but those jugs will be heavy when they're full." I volunteered immediately, partly out of a sense of duty and partly because I was getting restless cooped up inside. Camden offered to come with me, along with 2 other scouts, Ryan, a quiet kid with thick glasses, and Brandon, who was known for his nervous laugh and tendency to jump at shadows. The 4 of us loaded the empty jugs into backpacks and prepared to venture out into the fog. As we stepped off the cabin's front porch, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees, The fog muffled all sound, creating a bubble of silence that moved with us as we walked. Our footsteps on the pine needle path sounded unnaturally loud, and I found myself walking more quietly without consciously deciding to do so. The trail was well marked with small wooden posts, but the limited visibility made it feel like we were walking through an endless gray void. About halfway to our destination, we discovered something that would prove crucial later that night. Beside the trail, partially hidden by overgrown bushes, sat an old wooden cart with 2 large wheels and a long handle. It looked like something a groundskeeper might use to haul tools or supplies around the property. The wood was weathered and gray, but the cart appeared sturdy enough to handle some weight. "This could save us a lot of effort," I said, testing the handle. The cart rolled smoothly despite its age, and I realized it would be perfect for transporting the heavy water jugs back to the cabin. We made a mental note of its location and continued toward the pump house. The pump house materialized out of the fog like something from a fever dream. It was a small concrete block building with a single yellow light fixture mounted above a heavy metal door. Next to it stood a more modern structure that appeared to be a shower facility for campers, complete with exterior spigots and an electrical meter that hummed quietly in the damp air. Between the 2 buildings, an old-fashioned hand pump extended from a concrete pad, its metal handle worn smooth by countless hands. What struck me most about the location was how isolated it felt. We were near the edge of a small lake that we could barely make out through the fog, its dark water lapping gently against an unseen shore. The entire area felt abandoned, as if we were the first people to visit in months or even years. Rust stains streaked down the sides of the pump house, and spider webs stretched between the buildings, heavy with moisture from the fog. Camden approached the pump handle while Ryan and Brandon stood guard with the empty jugs. The mechanism was stiff at first, requiring both of us to work the handle up and down before water began to flow. The liquid that emerged was ice cold and had a metallic taste that suggested it came from deep underground. As we filled the first jug, the sound of rushing water seemed absurdly loud in the fog-muffled environment. "This place gives me the creeps," Brandon whispered, his voice barely audible over the pumping sounds. He kept glancing around nervously, adjusting his glasses and shifting his weight from foot to foot. "It feels like we're being watched." I'd been thinking the same thing but hadn't wanted to voice it. There was something about the pump house area that felt wrong, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what. Maybe it was the way the fog seemed thicker here, or how the yellow light created harsh shadows that shifted and moved with every small breeze. Or maybe it was the absolute silence from the lake, which should have been alive with the sounds of waterfowl and insects, but instead seemed completely dead. As we filled the second jug, Ryan pointed toward the shower building. "Look at that," he said quietly. Through one of the windows, we could see what appeared to be a figure standing motionless inside. The silhouette was barely visible through the grimy glass and fog, but it was definitely human-shaped and seemed to be facing in our direction. We all froze, staring at the window. After several long seconds, Camden called out, "Hello? Is someone in there?" His voice cracked slightly with nervousness. There was no response. The figure didn't move or acknowledge us in any way. After another minute of watching, the silhouette seemed to fade away, though whether it had moved or was simply obscured by shifting fog was impossible to tell. "Probably just shadows," I said, trying to convince myself as much as the others. "The fog is playing tricks on us." But as we filled the third and final jug, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were indeed being observed. Every few minutes, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, dark shapes that seemed to duck behind the buildings or slip back into the fog whenever I turned to look directly at them. The other boys were experiencing the same thing. I could see it in their tense postures and the way they kept scanning our surroundings. By the time we finished filling the water jugs, the fog had begun to lift slightly, revealing more of the lake and surrounding area. What we saw didn't make us feel any better. The lake stretched away into the distance, its surface perfectly still and black as oil. No boats were visible, no docks or other signs of human activity. On the far shore, dense forest pressed right up to the water's edge, creating an unbroken wall of dark trees. Loading the 3 full water jugs onto the cart we'd found proved to be more challenging than expected. Each jug now weighed over 40 pounds, and the cart's wooden bed was just barely large enough to accommodate all three. Camden and I worked together to secure them with some bungee cords we'd brought, while Ryan and Brandon kept watch for any signs of the mysterious figure we'd seen in the shower building. The journey back to the cabin should have been straightforward, but the fog was playing havoc with our sense of direction. The wooden trail markers seemed to appear and disappear at random, and more than once we had to backtrack when the path seemed to fork in directions we didn't remember from our trip down. The cart's wheels, which had rolled smoothly when empty, now squeaked and groaned under the weight of the water, creating a rhythmic noise that seemed to echo strangely in the muffled air. About halfway back, we encountered something that made us all stop dead in our tracks. Stretched across the trail at about chest height was a single strand of spider web, but it was unlike any web I'd ever seen. The silk was thick and almost rope-like, glistening with moisture from the fog. What made it truly disturbing was its placement. It was positioned perfectly to catch someone walking down the trail, and it was far too large and strong to have been created by any ordinary spider. "That wasn't there when we came down," Camden said quietly, his voice tight with anxiety. He was right. We definitely would have walked into it on our way to the pump house. Someone or something had placed it there while we were filling the water jugs. Brandon laughed nervously. "Maybe it's just a really big spider, like those ones you see in nature documentaries." But his attempt at humor fell flat. We all knew that no spider in Michigan could create a web like this. I used a stick to break the web and clear the path, but the incident left us all even more on edge. As we continued toward the cabin, I noticed that the boys were unconsciously bunching together, staying as close to the cart as possible. The fog seemed to be closing in around us again, reducing our visibility to just a few feet in any direction. When we finally reached the cabin, the other scouts and leaders greeted us with obvious relief. Apparently, we'd been gone much longer than anyone expected, nearly 3 hours for what should have been a simple 1-hour round trip. Mr. Rodriguez looked particularly concerned as he helped us unload the water jugs. "Everything go okay down there?" he asked, studying our faces. "You boys look like you've seen a ghost." I exchanged glances with Camden before answering. "Just took longer than we thought. The fog made navigation tricky." I didn't mention the figure in the shower building or the mysterious web across the trail. Something told me that talking about those incidents would only make them seem more real, more threatening. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly. The fog finally lifted around 4 o'clock, revealing the full extent of our isolation. In every direction, unbroken forest stretched to the horizon. No roads were visible, no power lines, no signs of civilization except for the faint trail we'd followed to the pump house. The cabin suddenly felt like a tiny island of safety in a vast ocean of wilderness. As evening approached, Mr. Rodriguez made an announcement that filled me with dread. "We're going to need more water for tonight and tomorrow morning," he said, gesturing toward the 3 jugs we'd brought back. "A couple of you will need to make another run down to the pump house after dinner." My stomach dropped. The thought of returning to that isolated, fog-shrouded location was terrifying enough in daylight. The idea of going there after dark was almost unbearable. By 9 o'clock that evening, the temperature had dropped to near freezing, and a light frost was beginning to form on the cabin's windows. Inside, we'd built up a roaring fire in the stone fireplace, but the warmth seemed unable to penetrate the chill that had settled deep in my bones. When Mr. Rodriguez approached Camden and me about making the water run, I felt my heart begin to race. "I know it's not ideal timing," he said apologetically, "but we really can't wait until morning. We need water for cooking breakfast and cleaning up." He handed us each a heavy-duty flashlight and pointed toward the door. "Take the cart again and stick to the main trail. You should be back within an hour." I pulled on my heaviest coat and a pair of insulated gloves, but no amount of clothing could protect me from the feeling of dread that was growing stronger by the minute. From the moment I stepped outside the cabin's warm interior, every instinct I possessed screamed at me to turn around and go back inside. The darkness beyond our flashlight beams was absolute, a thick, suffocating blackness that seemed to swallow light and sound. Camden was trying to project confidence, but I could see the tension in his shoulders as we loaded the empty water jugs onto the cart. "It's just a quick trip," he said, as much to himself as to me. "Down and back, no problem." The trail that had been merely unsettling in daylight fog now felt actively malevolent in the darkness. Our flashlight beams created moving circles of visibility that only emphasized how much we couldn't see. The pine trees pressed in close on both sides, their branches creating overhead canopies that blocked out even the faint starlight. Every few steps, we'd hear sounds in the darkness. Snapping twigs, rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl that sounded almost human. About 10 minutes into our journey, we reached the area where we'd found the cart earlier that day. During daylight, it had seemed like a perfectly normal section of trail. Now, in the darkness, it felt like entering a different world entirely. The trees here were older and larger, their massive trunks disappearing into the blackness above our heads. The undergrowth was thicker too, creating countless hiding places where anything could be lurking just beyond the reach of our lights. "Did you hear that?" Camden whispered suddenly, stopping so abruptly that I nearly crashed the cart into him. I listened carefully, but heard only the wind moving through the pine needles overhead. "Hear what?" Footsteps, like someone walking parallel to the trail, keeping pace with us. His voice was barely audible, and I could see his hands shaking as he gripped his flashlight. We stood motionless for nearly a minute, straining to hear anything unusual. The forest around us was silent, except for the natural sounds of wind and settling branches. But as we started walking again, I began to notice what Camden was talking about. There was a subtle rhythm in the background noise, a pattern that seemed to match our own footsteps but remained just out of sync enough to be noticeable. "It's probably just echoes," I said. But my voice lacked conviction. The sound was too deliberate, too consistent to be a simple echo. Whatever was making it was definitely keeping pace with us, staying roughly 20 or 30 feet off the trail, but matching our speed exactly. As we approached the fenced area where the canoes and kayaks were stored, the feeling of being watched intensified dramatically. The chain-link fence created geometric shadows in our flashlight beams, turning the familiar storage area into a maze of dark spaces where anything could be hiding. The boats themselves, overturned and covered with tarps, looked like sleeping animals in the darkness. "I can't do this," I said suddenly, stopping the cart and turning to face Camden. "Something is seriously wrong out here. We need to go back and get more people, or wait until morning." Camden's face was pale in the flashlight beam, but he shook his head stubbornly. "We're already halfway there. It would take just as long to go back as to keep going forward." He was right, mathematically speaking, but every fiber of my being was telling me to retreat. The sensation of being stalked had grown so strong that I felt like prey being herded toward a trap. But Camden was already walking ahead, and I couldn't abandon him to face whatever was out there alone. The pump house area looked entirely different in the darkness. The single yellow light above the door cast harsh shadows that seemed to move and shift with every small breeze, creating a constantly changing landscape of bright spots and impenetrable black pools. The lake beyond was invisible except for the occasional glint of reflected light on its surface, making it feel like we were standing at the edge of an abyss. As we approached the pump, I noticed immediately that something was wrong. The area around the buildings, which had been empty during our afternoon visit, was now littered with what looked like debris. Pieces of cloth, scattered papers, and dark stains on the concrete that definitely hadn't been there before. Camden saw it too, and we both stopped about 20 feet away from the pump. "Maybe someone else was here," he suggested, but his voice was uncertain. "Another camping group or something." I swept my flashlight beam across the scattered materials, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. The cloth pieces looked like they might have been clothing at one point, but they were now just torn rags covered in mud and what might have been dried blood. The papers were too damaged to read, but they appeared to be pages torn from books or magazines. "We should go back," I said firmly. "Right now. Something happened here." But before Camden could respond, we heard a sound that made both of us freeze in terror. From somewhere inside the shower building came a low, rhythmic thumping noise like someone pounding on a wall or door. The sound was muffled but persistent, and it seemed to be coming from multiple locations within the building simultaneously. Camden grabbed my arm. "There's someone trapped in there," he whispered urgently. "We have to help them." Every rational part of my mind was screaming that this was exactly the wrong thing to do, but the possibility that someone was in distress overrode my survival instincts. We approached the shower building cautiously, our flashlights trained on the dark windows. The thumping sounds continued, sometimes from the left side of the building, sometimes from the right, as if whatever was making them was moving around inside. "Hello?" Camden called out, his voice echoing strangely in the night air. "Is someone in there? Do you need help?" The thumping stopped immediately. The silence that followed was somehow more terrifying than the noise had been. We waited for several long minutes, but there was no response, no indication that anyone had heard us. "Maybe it was just pipes," I suggested weakly. "Old building, water pressure issues." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The sounds had been too deliberate, too purposeful. And now, as we stood in the harsh yellow light, I was becoming aware of another disturbing detail. The ground around the shower building was covered with footprints, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all leading to and from the building in a chaotic pattern that suggested frantic activity. Some of the prints were clearly human, but others were harder to identify. They were roughly the same size as human footprints, but seemed to have an odd shape, as if the person making them had been wearing unusual shoes or had some kind of physical deformity. "We need to fill the water and get out of here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Right now." Camden nodded, and we hurried to the pump. The mechanism worked exactly as it had during our afternoon visit, but every sound seemed amplified in the darkness. The squeak of the handle, the rush of water into the jugs, even our own breathing seemed absurdly loud. I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, convinced that something was approaching from the darkness behind us. As we filled the second jug, the thumping sounds from the shower building resumed. This time, they were accompanied by what sounded like scratching or scraping, as if someone was dragging fingernails across metal or concrete. The noises were definitely coming from inside the building, but they seemed to be moving around in ways that defied logic, sometimes from the ceiling, sometimes from the walls, sometimes from what sounded like underground. "Hurry up," Camden urged, his voice tight with panic. "Whatever's in there, I don't want to meet it." We were loading the third and final jug onto the cart when I saw movement in my peripheral vision. Something large and dark had emerged from behind the pump house and was moving toward us with deliberate, measured steps. I spun around, training my flashlight beam in that direction, but the light revealed only empty ground and the dark tree line beyond. "Did you see that?" I asked Camden, but he was already pushing the cart toward the trail, eager to get away from the pump house area. "I saw something," he replied grimly. "Let's talk about it when we're back at the cabin." The return journey began badly and only got worse. The cart, now loaded with over 120 pounds of water, was much harder to maneuver on the uneven trail. The wheels caught on roots and rocks, and several times we nearly lost control entirely as we navigated around curves in the darkness. Our flashlight beams, which had seemed adequate on the way down, now felt pathetically weak against the surrounding blackness. We'd been walking for maybe 10 minutes when Camden suddenly grabbed my arm. "Listen," he whispered urgently. I stopped pushing the cart and strained my ears. At first, I heard only the normal sounds of the forest, wind through the trees, the distant hoot of an owl, the creak of settling branches. But then I caught it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps on the trail behind us. Not the subtle, off-rhythm sounds we'd heard earlier, but clear, deliberate footsteps that were definitely following us and getting closer. We both turned around, shining our flashlights back down the trail. The beams revealed nothing but empty paths stretching away into the darkness, but the footstep sounds continued. Whatever was making them was staying just beyond the reach of our lights, matching our pace and maintaining a consistent distance. "Maybe it's another camper," Camden suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Someone else who needed water." I didn't bother responding. Every instinct I possessed was telling me that whatever was following us was not another camper. The footsteps had an odd quality to them, as if the person making them was having trouble maintaining a normal walking rhythm. Sometimes they came in quick bursts, sometimes they dragged slightly, and occasionally they seemed to pause for several seconds before resuming. We picked up our pace, pushing the cart as fast as we dared on the rough trail. The footsteps behind us immediately matched our increased speed. When we slowed down to navigate around a fallen branch, the sound slowed down too. Whatever was back there was definitely tracking us. As we approached the fenced area with the canoes and kayaks, the feeling of impending danger became almost overwhelming. This was the same spot where I'd felt most uneasy during our afternoon trip, and now, in the darkness, it felt like walking into an ambush. The chain-link fence created a maze of shadows, and the overturned boats provided countless hiding places for anything that might be waiting for us. "We need to move fast through this section," I told Camden. "Don't stop for anything." He nodded, and we pushed the cart forward at a near-jogging pace. The water jugs bounced and sloshed with our increased speed, and I was terrified that one of them would fall off and we'd have to stop to retrieve it. The footsteps behind us were getting closer now, no longer making any attempt at stealth. I could hear them clearly over the sound of the cart wheels and our own labored breathing. We were about halfway through the fenced area when Camden suddenly screamed. "What the hell is that?" I spun around to look where he was pointing, and my blood froze in my veins. Standing at the far end of the fenced area, clearly visible in our combined flashlight beams, was a figure that looked human, but moved in ways that were definitely not human. It was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothing that seemed to flutter and shift even though there was no wind. But what made it truly terrifying was the way it moved, not walking or running, but flowing across the ground like smoke, covering distance with impossible speed. "Run!" I shouted, abandoning any pretense of staying calm. We both broke into a sprint, leaving the cart behind in our panic. Camden, being smaller and faster, immediately pulled ahead of me, but I kept pace as best I could despite my injured knee and the 30-pound backpack I was still wearing. Behind us, I could hear the sound of something large crashing through the underbrush, moving much faster than any human could run. The trail that had seemed endless during our careful walk down now flashed by in a blur of pine trees and shadows. My lungs burned from the cold air and exertion, and my injured knee was sending shooting pains up my leg with every step, but I didn't dare slow down. Whatever was chasing us was gaining ground, and I could hear it breathing. Deep, ragged gasps that sounded more animal than human. Camden was shouting something ahead of me, but I couldn't make out the words over the sound of my own pounding heartbeat and the crashing noises behind us. All I could think about was reaching the cabin, getting inside, and barricading the door against whatever was out there in the darkness. We burst through the cabin door like our lives depended on it, which they very well might have. Camden immediately slammed the door behind us and threw the deadbolt, while I collapsed onto the nearest chair, gasping for breath and shaking uncontrollably. The warm interior of the cabin felt like a sanctuary after the nightmare we'd just experienced, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't truly safe yet. Mr. Rodriguez and several other scouts immediately surrounded us, demanding to know what had happened and where we'd left the water. Between gasping breaths, I managed to explain that we'd had to abandon the cart and run, though I left out most of the details about what we'd seen. Camden was in even worse shape than me, shaking so badly he could barely speak. "Something was chasing us," he finally managed to say. "It wasn't human. It moved like nothing I've ever seen before." Mr. Rodriguez looked skeptical but concerned. "Are you sure it wasn't just a bear or a deer that spooked you? The mind can play tricks on you in the dark woods." I wanted to tell him about the figure we'd seen, about the way it had moved across the ground without seeming to touch it, but I knew how crazy it would sound. Instead, I just nodded and let him think we'd been frightened by a wild animal. After we'd warmed up and calmed down somewhat, Camden pulled me aside and described what he'd seen that made him scream. "When we got to the fence area," he said quietly, "I saw someone in my peripheral vision. A man, but not normal. He was running toward us at full speed, but he was running wrong, like his legs were too long, or his joints bent the wrong way. And when I blinked and looked directly at him, he just vanished. I believed him completely. I'd heard the running footsteps and had seen something myself, a dark silhouette that seemed to flicker in and out of existence at the edge of my vision. Whatever had been stalking us through the forest was not a bear or a deer or any other normal woodland creature. None of us got much rest that night. Every small sound outside the cabin, the wind in the trees, settling branches, the distant call of an owl, made us all tense up and stare toward the windows. I kept my flashlight next to my sleeping bag and jumped at every shadow that moved across the moonlit walls. When dawn finally arrived, painting the forest in shades of gray and gold, Mr. Rodriguez organized a search party to retrieve the abandoned water cart. I volunteered to go along, partly out of curiosity, and partly because I needed to see the area in daylight to convince myself that what we'd experienced was real. The walk back to the fenced area in broad daylight was surreal. The trail that had seemed so threatening in the darkness now looked perfectly normal, just a dirt path winding through pine trees. But when we reached the spot where we'd abandoned the cart, we found evidence that our terror had been justified. The cart was exactly where we'd left it, with all 3 water jugs still secure in the wooden bed. But the ground around it told a disturbing story. The soft earth was covered with footprints, dozens of them, all apparently made by the same person. The prints circled the cart multiple times, as if someone had been examining it carefully from every angle. But these weren't normal footprints. They were elongated and narrow, at least twice as long as any human foot should be. The impressions were deep too, suggesting that whatever made them was either very heavy or moving with tremendous force. Most disturbing of all, some of the prints showed what appeared to be claw marks at the toe end. Camden and I exchanged glances but said nothing. Mr. Rodriguez and the other adults examined the prints with obvious puzzlement, but no one offered any explanations. We loaded the cart and headed back to the cabin in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts about what we'd discovered. As we packed up our gear later that morning, preparing for the drive home, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief to be leaving. The cabin that had seemed like an adventure just 2 days earlier now felt like a trap, and the surrounding forest seemed to press in on us with malevolent intent. But as our convoy of vehicles pulled away from the clearing and began the long drive back to civilization, I caught one final glimpse of something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. In my side mirror, I saw a tall, dark figure standing at the edge of the tree line, watching us leave. It was too far away to make out any details, but something about its posture and the way it held itself made it clear that it wasn't human. Camden saw it too. He gripped my arm and pointed back toward the cabin, but when we both turned around to look directly, the figure was gone. Only empty forest remained, peaceful and normal in the morning sunlight. To this day, I'm not sure what we encountered in those woods. Was it some kind of hermit living wild in the forest? A person with severe mental illness who had been stalking campers? Or was it something else entirely? Something that science hasn't cataloged and probably wouldn't believe? I've never been able to find the exact location of that cabin again. Mr. Rodriguez left our scout troop a few months later, and the rental records seem to have disappeared. Sometimes I wonder if the whole experience was some kind of shared delusion, a mass hysteria brought on by isolation and darkness. But then, I remember the footprints we found the next morning, and the look of absolute terror on Camden's face when he saw that figure running toward us. Whatever was stalking us through those dark woods was real, and it's still out there somewhere, waiting in the shadows for the next group of unsuspecting campers to venture too far from safety. I pray to God that I never have to find out what it really was. The summer of 2019 started like any other for me, an 11-year-old kid from suburban Minnesota. My parents had enrolled me in Cedar Ridge Summer Camp, a rustic facility nestled deep in the North Woods, 3 hours from the nearest town. The promotional brochures showed happy children swimming in crystal-clear lakes and roasting marshmallows around campfires. But nothing could have prepared me for what I would experience during those 2 weeks in July. I arrived on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon, my duffel bag slung over my shoulder and my stomach churning with nervous excitement. The camp consisted of 12 weathered wooden cabins arranged in a horseshoe pattern around a central fire pit. Towering pine trees created a canopy so thick that even in broad daylight, shadows danced ominously across the ground. The air hung heavy with the scent of pine needles and something else I couldn't quite identify. Something musty and decaying that seemed to emanate from the deeper parts of the forest. My cabin, number 7, housed 8 boys and was supervised by a counselor named Brett, a lanky college sophomore with sun-bleached hair and an easy smile that somehow never quite reached his eyes. My bunk was positioned near the back wall, directly beneath a small window that faced the woods. The floorboards creaked and groaned with every step, and the thin mattress smelled faintly of mildew despite the fresh sheets. My bunkmate was a kid named Connor from Milwaukee, a stocky 12-year-old with freckles and an infectious laugh. We hit it off immediately, bonding over our shared love of horror movies and video games. As we unpacked our belongings that first afternoon, Connor regaled me with stories he'd heard about the camp from his older brother, who had attended 3 years prior. "Brandon told me weird stuff happens here at night," Connor whispered as we arranged our clothes in the shared dresser. "He said they had to move kids out of cabin 12 because of some kind of incident. Nobody talks about it anymore." I laughed it off then, assuming it was just typical camp folklore designed to spook newcomers. The rational part of my brain dismissed such tales as harmless fun, but something about the way Connor's voice dropped to barely above a whisper made the hair on my arms stand up. That evening, we gathered around the central fire pit for orientation and introductions. The flames cast flickering shadows on the surrounding trees, creating the illusion that the forest itself was alive and watching us. Brett and the other counselors led us through camp songs and shared the rules and expectations for our stay. Everything seemed normal enough, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being observed by something lurking just beyond the ring of firelight. As bedtime approached, the counselors herded us back to our respective cabins. The transition from the warm glow of the campfire to the suffocating darkness of the woods was jarring. Our flashlights created small circles of light that seemed pitifully inadequate against the vast expanse of blackness surrounding us. Every snapping twig and rustling leaf made my heart skip a beat. Once inside cabin 7, Brett gave us the nightly rundown. Lights out by 10:30. No talking after that time, and absolutely no leaving the cabin until morning unless it was a genuine emergency. The bathroom facilities were housed in a separate building about 50 yards away, connected to our cabin by a narrow gravel path. A single motion sensor light illuminated the route, but its coverage was sporadic at best. As I lay in my bunk that first night, listening to the settling sounds of the old building and the gentle snoring of my fellow campers, I felt reasonably safe. The camp had been operating for over 30 years without any serious incidents, and the staff seemed competent and caring. Whatever stories Connor's brother had shared were probably exaggerated tales designed to enhance the camp's mystique. If only I had known then how wrong I was. The second night at Cedar Ridge started innocently enough. We had spent the day hiking along the lakeshore, learning basic wilderness survival skills and participating in a capture-the-flag tournament that left us all exhausted but exhilarated. After a dinner of grilled hamburgers and corn on the cob, we returned to our cabin ready for a good night's rest. Connor and I had settled into our bunks around 10:15, whispering about the day's activities and making plans for tomorrow's canoeing expedition. Brett made his rounds, checking that everyone was accounted for and reasonably quiet, before settling into his own bed near the front of the cabin. The familiar sounds of settling wood and distant night birds gradually lulled most of the boys to sleep. I must have drifted off around 11, but sometime later, my watch showed it was exactly 2:17 a.m. when I first looked. I was jolted awake by a sound unlike anything I had ever heard. It started as a low, rhythmic thumping directly above my head, as if something enormous was walking across the roof with deliberate, measured steps. Each footfall sent vibrations through the entire structure, causing the wooden beams to creak and groan in protest. But it wasn't just the footsteps that made my stomach clench with fear. Between each heavy thud, I could distinctly hear what sounded like deep, labored breathing. The kind of breathing you might expect from something that had been running hard or carrying an enormous weight. The sound was so close that it seemed to be coming from just inches above the thin roof, and I could swear I felt warm air moving through the gaps in the wooden planks. I lay frozen in my bunk, every muscle tensed, and my heart hammering so hard I was certain everyone in the cabin could hear it. Connor was still asleep in the bunk next to mine, his face peaceful and undisturbed. Across the room, I could see that several other boys were stirring restlessly, but none seemed fully awake. Even Brett appeared to be sleeping soundly, his breathing deep and regular. The walking continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. Whatever was up there moved with purpose, traversing the length of the roof from one end to the other in a methodical pattern. Occasionally, the footsteps would pause directly over my bunk, and during these moments, the breathing would become more pronounced, almost as if the thing was listening or searching for something specific. I wanted desperately to wake Connor or call out to Brett, but something primal and instinctual kept me silent. Every fiber of my being screamed that drawing attention to myself would be a terrible mistake. Instead, I pulled my sleeping bag up over my head and tried to convince myself that it was just a large animal, maybe a bear or a moose that had somehow found its way onto the roof. But even as I tried to rationalize what I was hearing, I knew that no animal moved with such deliberate precision. No animal breathed with that kind of measured, almost human-like rhythm. And no animal I could think of would be large enough to create footsteps that heavy while still being able to balance on a cabin roof. Eventually, the sounds stopped as abruptly as they had begun. The sudden silence was almost more unnerving than the noise had been, and I spent the remaining hours until dawn straining my ears for any hint that the thing might return. When morning finally came, I felt as though I hadn't slept at all. At breakfast, I casually mentioned to Connor that I thought I had heard something on the roof during the night. He looked at me with a puzzled expression and said he hadn't heard anything unusual. When I brought it up with a couple of the other boys from our cabin, they gave me similar responses. Either I was the only light sleeper in the group, or whatever had been up there had specifically chosen to manifest itself only to me. The rational part of my brain suggested that I had probably been dreaming or experiencing some kind of sleep paralysis episode. Camp was a new environment, and it made sense that my subconscious might conjure up strange scenarios. But deep down, I knew what I had heard was real. The memory of those deliberate footsteps and labored breathing was too vivid, too detailed to be the product of my imagination. As we prepared for another day of camp activities, I made a mental note to pay closer attention to my surroundings and to trust my instincts if anything else seemed amiss. What I didn't realize was that the previous night's events were just the beginning of something far more terrifying than my young mind could have possibly conceived. The third night at Cedar Ridge brought with it a thick humidity that made the air feel heavy and oppressive. Storm clouds had been building throughout the day, and by evening the atmosphere was charged with the electric tension that precedes a major thunderstorm. The temperature had dropped significantly from the sweltering heat we had endured earlier in the week, and most of us had changed into long pants and sweatshirts for the evening campfire. Our nightly gathering around the fire pit was cut short when the first fat raindrops began to fall. Brett and the other counselors quickly herded us back to our cabins as the wind picked up and lightning began to flicker in the distance. Within minutes of reaching Cabin 7, the sky opened up completely, unleashing a torrential downpour that drummed against the roof with an intensity that made conversation nearly impossible. The storm created an entirely different atmosphere in our cabin. Instead of the usual easy chatter and gradual wind down toward bedtime, we found ourselves gathered around our bunks, listening to the thunder rolling across the lake and watching lightning illuminate the windows in brief, stark flashes. The violence of the weather outside made our small wooden shelter feel even more fragile and isolated than usual. Around 10 o'clock, Brett announced that it was time for final bathroom visits before lights out. Due to the severity of the storm, he decided to escort groups of boys to the bathroom facility rather than letting us make the trip individually. The separate bathroom building, which housed toilets and sinks for 3 cabins, was only about 50 yards away, but the combination of driving rain and limited lighting made the journey treacherous. I was in the last group to make the trip, along with Connor and 2 other boys. We pulled on rain jackets and sprint across the muddy path, our flashlights creating weak beams that were quickly swallowed by the darkness and rain. The bathroom building was a simple concrete block structure with no windows except for 4 small rectangular openings near the ceiling that were covered with metal grating. These openings were designed for ventilation, but also served as the only source of natural light during daytime hours. Once inside, we quickly took care of business while Brett waited outside under the small overhang by the door. The interior lighting consisted of 2 fluorescent fixtures that cast harsh, institutional shadows across the white-painted walls. The combination of the storm noise and the buzzing of the fluorescent bulbs created an unsettling, ambient sound that made my skin crawl. As we prepared to leave, Brett counted heads and realized that one of the boys from an earlier group had left the lights on when they departed. Camp rules were strict about conserving electricity, and leaving lights on unnecessarily was a violation that could result in lost privileges. Since I was the last person to use the facilities, Brett asked me to go back inside and turn off the lights before we returned to our cabin. I reluctantly agreed, though something about re-entering that sterile, harshly lit space made my stomach tighten with apprehension. The others waited outside while I pushed open the heavy metal door and stepped back into the bathroom. The fluorescent bulbs hummed overhead, casting their cold light across the concrete floor and utilitarian fixtures. I moved quickly toward the light switches, eager to complete this simple task and rejoin the group. But as I reached for the switches, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet by at least 20 degrees. My breath began to fog in the suddenly frigid air, and I could feel goosebumps rising on my arms beneath my rain jacket. That's when I noticed movement outside one of the small grated windows near the ceiling. At first, I thought it might be a tree branch swaying in the storm wind, but as I looked more closely, I realized that what I was seeing defied any rational explanation. A figure, impossibly tall and unnaturally thin, was walking slowly around the perimeter of the bathroom building. The grated window was at least 8 feet from the ground, yet I could clearly see the upper portion of this thing as it moved past each opening in sequence. The lightning provided intermittent illumination that revealed horrifying details I wish I could forget. The figure's skin appeared gray and mottled, stretched tightly over a frame that seemed to consist mostly of jutting bones and sharp angles. Its arms were disproportionately long, hanging almost to its knees, and its fingers appeared to be nothing more than skeletal protrusions covered by a thin membrane of flesh. But it was the way it moved that filled me with the most terror. Each step was deliberate and calculated, as if it was searching for something specific. The thing paused at each window, and though I couldn't see its face clearly through the grating, I had the unmistakable sensation that it was peering inside, looking for something or someone. When it reached the window directly above where I was standing, it stopped completely. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, the figure remained motionless outside that window. I could hear its breathing now, the same deep, labored breathing I had heard on the roof 2 nights earlier. The sound was so close and so pronounced that I was certain it was looking directly at me through the metal grating. Terror flooded my system like ice water in my veins. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. My hands shook so violently that I could barely manage to flip the light switches, plunging the bathroom into complete darkness except for the occasional flash of lightning from outside. I stumbled toward the door in the blackness, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. As I fumbled for the door handle, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving away from the building, fading gradually into the storm noise. By the time I burst through the door and rejoined Brett and the other boys, whatever I had seen was gone. The return trip to our cabin was a blur of rain and terror. I said nothing to the others about what I had witnessed, partly because I doubted they would believe me, and partly because I was still trying to process what I had seen myself. Once back in our bunk, I lay awake for hours, listening to the storm and jumping at every sound, no matter how innocent. When morning came and the storm had passed, I tried to convince myself that what I had seen was a product of fear and imagination, amplified by the dramatic weather and the harsh lighting in the bathroom. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that something real and terrifying was stalking the grounds of Cedar Ridge Summer Camp. The following morning dawned clear and crisp, with the kind of perfect weather that makes summer camps profitable and parents happy. The storm had washed the air clean, and everything sparkled with residual moisture that caught the early sunlight like thousands of tiny diamonds. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a beautiful day for outdoor activities and camp adventures. But I found it impossible to enjoy the sunshine and fresh air when my mind kept replaying the events of the previous night. During breakfast, I studied the faces of my fellow campers and the counselors, searching for any sign that someone else had seen or heard something unusual. Everyone seemed relaxed and cheerful, discussing plans for the day's activities and making jokes about who had been most frightened by the thunder. Connor noticed my distracted state and asked if I was feeling all right. I considered telling him about what I had witnessed in the bathroom, but something held me back. How could I explain that I had seen an 8-foot-tall skeletal figure stalking around the building without sounding like I was either lying or losing my mind? Instead, I mumbled something about not sleeping well due to the storm and tried to focus on my scrambled eggs. After breakfast, our activity schedule called for a nature hike along one of the trails that wound through the forest surrounding the camp. Brett divided us into smaller groups and assigned each group a different route, with the understanding that we would all meet back at the main lodge for lunch. Connor and I ended up in a group of 6 boys exploring what was called the North Trail, a 2-mile loop that supposedly offered excellent opportunities for wildlife observation and plant identification. As we walked deeper into the woods, I found myself paying attention to details that had previously escaped my notice. The trees in this part of the forest were older and larger than those immediately surrounding the camp, creating a canopy so thick that very little sunlight reached the forest floor. The undergrowth was sparse, consisting mainly of ferns and moss that thrived in the perpetual twilight beneath the towering pines. About halfway through our hike, we came across something that made my blood freeze. In a small clearing where a massive oak tree had fallen years earlier, the ground was covered with what appeared to be footprints. But these weren't the prints of any animal I had ever seen or studied in nature books. They were humanoid in shape but impossibly large, easily 18 inches long and proportionally narrow. The impressions were deep, suggesting that whatever had made them was extremely heavy, and they led from the tree line on one side of the clearing to the other. I knelt down to examine the prints more closely while the other boys continued their plant collecting and general exploration. The level of detail preserved in the soft earth was remarkable. I could see distinct toe impressions, each one unnaturally long and ending in what appeared to be sharp points. The heel print was narrow and deep, as if the thing that made it walked primarily on the balls of its feet. "Hey, check this out," called one of the other boys from across the clearing. "There's something weird over here." We all gathered around what he had discovered, scratches in the bark of several trees that formed an unmistakable pattern. The marks were too high off the ground to have been made by any normal animal, and they were too regular and deliberate to be the result of natural wear or storm damage. Someone or something had carved these symbols into the trees with considerable force and precision. Brett, who had been examining some wildflowers nearby, came over to investigate. When he saw the scratches, his expression changed from casual interest to something that looked like concern or possibly recognition. He studied the marks for several long moments before announcing that it was time to move on and complete our hike. "What do you think made those marks?" Connor asked as we resumed walking. "Probably just bears marking their territory," Brett replied, but his tone lacked conviction. "It's pretty common in these woods." I wanted to point out that the scratches were too high and too precise to be bear marks, and that the footprints we had found didn't match any bear tracks I had ever seen. But something about Brett's demeanor discouraged further questions. He seemed eager to put distance between our group and the clearing, and he maintained a brisk pace for the remainder of our hike. That afternoon, during a brief rest period between activities, I decided to do some investigating on my own. The camp had a small library in the main lodge, consisting mostly of nature guides and basic reference books for educational purposes. I told Connor I wanted to look up some of the plants we had seen on our hike, which wasn't entirely untrue, and spent an hour browsing through field guides and wildlife references. What I found was both fascinating and terrifying. Several of the books contained sections on local folklore and historical accounts of the region, including stories dating back to the early logging days of the late 1800s. According to these accounts, the area around what was now Cedar Ridge had been the site of numerous unexplained disappearances and strange sightings over the past century and a half. The most relevant account came from a 1923 newspaper article that had been reprinted in one of the local history books. It described the discovery of a logging camp that had been mysteriously abandoned overnight, with no signs of struggle or obvious explanation for why the workers had fled. The only clues were a series of enormous footprints found around the perimeter of the camp and strange scratches carved into nearby trees. The description of the footprints matched what we had seen in the clearing that morning with unsettling accuracy. According to the article, they were of human configuration, but far larger than any man could produce, with elongated toes terminating in what appeared to be claws or talons. The tree scratches were described as deliberate markings suggesting intelligence and purpose rather than random animal behavior. As I read these accounts, a pattern began to emerge. Every few decades, there would be reports of unusual activity in this part of the forest: missing persons, abandoned campsites, livestock found dead under mysterious circumstances. The incidents would cluster over a period of weeks or months, then disappear for years at a time, only to resurface when conditions were right. The most recent cluster of incidents had occurred in the summer of 2016, just 3 years before my arrival at camp. According to a brief mention in a local newspaper archive, a family camping in the area had reported seeing a tall, emaciated figure stalking around their campsite during the night. They had packed up and left the following morning, despite having reserved the site for a full week. By the time I finished my research, I was more convinced than ever that something genuinely dangerous was active in the area around Cedar Ridge. The question was whether the camp administrators were aware of this history and simply choosing to ignore it, or if they were deliberately concealing information that could affect the safety of their campers. Either way, I realized that I was probably on my own when it came to dealing with whatever was lurking in the woods around our camp. The rational adult response would be to pack up and leave immediately, but as an 11-year-old camper with no control over my transportation or living arrangements, that option wasn't available to me. All I could do was stay alert, trust my instincts, and hope that whatever was out there would lose interest and move on before something truly terrible happened. By the 5th night at Cedar Ridge, I had developed a routine of hypervigilance that was beginning to take a serious toll on my physical and mental state. I was sleeping poorly, eating little, and jumping at every unexpected sound or movement. Connor had noticed my increasing anxiety and had begun asking pointed questions about my well-being, but I continued to deflect his concerns with vague explanations about homesickness and adjustment difficulties. The truth was that I had been experiencing minor encounters with whatever was stalking the campgrounds almost every night since the bathroom incident. These weren't dramatic, obvious sightings like what I had witnessed during the storm, but rather subtle signs that something unnatural was taking an active interest in our presence. On the 4th night, I had awakened around 3 a.m. to the sound of something large moving through the underbrush directly behind our cabin. The movement was too deliberate and sustained to be a deer or other normal wildlife, and it seemed to circle our building multiple times before moving off toward the lake. In the morning, I found a series of broken branches and disturbed vegetation that traced the exact path I had heard the night before. The night after that, I noticed that the motion sensor light on the path to the bathroom was triggering repeatedly throughout the early morning hours, turning on for exactly 90 seconds before shutting off again. This cycle continued every 10 to 15 minutes from approximately 2 a.m. until dawn, but whenever I peered out the window to see what might be triggering the sensor, I saw nothing but empty pathway. Most disturbing of all were the sounds that had begun emanating from the forest around midnight each night. They started as distant, almost subsonic groaning noises that seemed to come from deep underground. Gradually, these sounds would increase in frequency and intensity until they resembled a kind of primitive communication, long, mournful calls that were answered by similar sounds from different directions in the woods. On the 5th night, these patterns escalated to a level that I could no longer ignore or rationalize away. Connor and I had gone to bed at the usual time, and I had spent several hours lying awake, listening for any unusual activity. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard the now familiar sound of heavy footsteps on the roof, but this time they were accompanied by a new element that made my stomach clench with terror. Scratching. Deliberate, rhythmic scratching that sounded like something was trying to claw its way through the wooden shingles and into our cabin. The scratching started directly above my bunk and continued for what felt like hours. I could hear individual claws or talons scraping against the wood, accompanied by the occasional sound of small pieces of debris raining down on the roof as material was gouged away. The rhythm was too regular and purposeful to be the result of an animal trying to build a nest or seek shelter. This was something attempting to gain entry to our sleeping area. I lay frozen in my bunk, afraid to move or make any sound that might draw attention to my specific location. Around me, my fellow campers continued to sleep peacefully, apparently oblivious to the activity taking place just inches above their heads. Even Connor, who was normally a light sleeper, showed no signs of being disturbed by the noise. After what seemed like an eternity, the scratching stopped as abruptly as it had begun. But instead of the relief I had expected to feel, I was gripped by an even more intense fear. If the thing had stopped trying to claw through the roof, what was it planning to do instead? My question was answered about 20 minutes later when I heard the soft sound of the cabin's front door opening. The door was supposed to be locked from the inside with a simple sliding bolt, but I distinctly heard the metallic scraping sound of the bolt being moved and the creak of hinges as the door swung open. Brett's sleeping area was positioned so that he should have been awakened immediately by any intrusion, but his breathing remained deep and regular. Soft footsteps began moving across the cabin floor toward the sleeping area where the campers' bunks were arranged. The footsteps were careful and measured, avoiding the creakiest floorboards with the precision of someone intimately familiar with the building's layout. I could track the progress of whatever had entered by listening to the slight sounds of displaced air and the barely perceptible vibrations transmitted through the wooden structure. The footsteps paused at the foot of each bunk, remaining motionless for 30 to 40 seconds before moving on to the next sleeping boy. I realized with growing horror that the thing was examining each of us individually, perhaps trying to determine which camper might be most suitable for whatever purpose it had in mind. When the footsteps reached my bunk, I had to exercise every ounce of self-control I possessed to maintain the facade of sleep. Through barely cracked eyelids, I could see a tall, impossibly thin shadow looming over my bed. The shadow had no defined edges, seeming to blend into the surrounding darkness, but I could sense its presence with a clarity that transcended normal sight. For what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes, the thing stood absolutely still beside my bunk. I could hear its breathing, the same deep, labored respirations I had heard before, and I could smell something that reminded me of wet earth and decay. The temperature around my bed seemed to drop by several degrees, and I had to concentrate on keeping my own breathing slow and regular, despite the panic flooding my system. Eventually, the shadow moved away from my bunk and continued its survey of the other sleeping boys. When it had apparently examined everyone in the cabin, the footsteps retraced their path toward the front door. I heard the door open and close again, followed by the sound of the bolt sliding back into place. But instead of leaving the area entirely, whatever had been in our cabin began circling the building from the outside. I could track its movement by listening to the soft sounds of displaced gravel and vegetation as it moved around the perimeter. Every few minutes, it would pause at one of the windows, and I could sense it peering inside, as if memorizing details about our sleeping arrangements for future reference. This surveillance continued until approximately 4 a.m., when the sounds finally faded into the general background noise of the forest. By the time dawn arrived, I was emotionally and physically exhausted, but I was also more determined than ever to find out what was happening at Cedar Ridge and why none of the adults seemed aware of or concerned about the obvious danger we were facing. As my fellow campers began stirring and preparing for another day of camp activities, I made a decision that would ultimately change the course of events. I was going to confront Brett directly about the strange occurrences, regardless of whether he believed me or dismissed my concerns as the overactive imagination of a frightened child. Something evil was stalking the grounds of Cedar Ridge Summer Camp, and it was escalating its behavior with each passing night. If the adults in charge weren't going to protect us, then I would have to find a way to protect myself and my fellow campers, even if it meant revealing knowledge that no 11-year-old should possess. The sixth morning at Cedar Ridge dawned gray and oppressive, with thick clouds that seemed to press down on the forest like a suffocating blanket. The usual cheerful breakfast chatter was replaced by a subdued atmosphere that I initially attributed to the gloomy weather. But as I looked around the dining hall, I noticed that several other campers appeared tired and on edge. Connor picked at his pancakes without enthusiasm, and when I asked if he was feeling all right, he gave me a strange look before answering. "I had the weirdest dreams last night," he said quietly. "I kept dreaming that someone was in our cabin standing next to my bed and watching me sleep. It felt so real that I woke up several times to check, but there was never anyone there." My blood went cold. Connor's dream perfectly matched what I had witnessed during the early morning hours, but from his perspective as someone who had remained asleep throughout the actual intrusion. If whatever was stalking us had the ability to influence the sleep and dreams of its targets, it explained why I seemed to be the only camper fully aware of the ongoing danger. I looked around the dining hall and noticed similar signs of disturbed sleep among several other boys. Dark circles under their eyes, distracted expressions, and an overall sense of unease that seemed disproportionate to the minor discomfort of sleeping in unfamiliar surroundings. Whatever was affecting the camp wasn't limiting its attention to our specific cabin. After breakfast, I asked Brett if I could speak with him privately about a personal matter. He agreed, and we walked to a quiet area behind the main lodge where we could talk without being overheard by other campers. I had rehearsed this conversation in my mind dozens of times, but now that the moment had arrived, I found it difficult to know where to begin. "Brett," I said finally, "have you noticed anything unusual happening around camp at night? Strange sounds or other things?" His expression shifted almost imperceptibly, but I caught a flash of something that looked like recognition before he composed himself and assumed a concerned, counselor demeanor. "What kind of strange sounds?" he asked carefully. I decided to be direct. "Footsteps on the roof. Something walking around the buildings. Heavy breathing. And last night, something came into our cabin while everyone was sleeping." Brett was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. When he finally spoke, his voice was much more serious than his usual casual tone. "How long have you been noticing these things?" "Since the second night. It's been getting worse every night since then." "Have you mentioned this to any of the other boys?" "No. They all seem to sleep through it. Except Connor thinks he's been having weird dreams." Brett nodded slowly, as if my answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "Listen," he said. "I need you to promise me that you won't discuss this with any of the other campers. Can you do that?" "Why? What's going on?" "There are some things about this place that most people don't need to know about, things that we normally don't have to deal with during camp sessions. But every few years, when conditions are right, we get some unusual activity in the area." "What kind of activity?" Brett glanced around to make sure we were still alone, then continued in a voice barely above a whisper. "The land where this camp is built has a history. A long history of things that can't be easily explained. Most of the time, whatever lives in these woods keeps to itself and doesn't bother people, but sometimes, especially during certain weather patterns or when there are a lot of people around, it gets curious. We're not exactly sure what it is. The local authorities have theories, but nothing that would satisfy most people. What we do know is that it's been here longer than the camp, longer than the logging operations that came before, probably longer than any human settlement in this area." I felt a mixture of validation and terror. At least I wasn't going crazy. But the confirmation that something genuinely dangerous was stalking us wasn't exactly comforting either. "Does the camp director know about this?" I asked. "The camp director, the local sheriff, the Department of Natural Resources, they all know. There's an informal understanding that as long as the incidents remain minor and no one gets hurt, everyone just manages the situation quietly." "What do you mean, manages the situation?" "We keep detailed records of any unusual activity. We have protocols for moving campers out of certain cabins if necessary, and we have arrangements with local law enforcement for emergency evacuations if things get too serious." "How serious do things usually get?" Brett hesitated before answering. "In the 32 years this camp has been operating, we've had to evacuate early 3 times. The last time was 2016. A family camping in the area reported an encounter that was significant enough to warrant shutting down operations for the remainder of that session." I remembered the newspaper account I had found in the camp library, the family who had packed up and left after seeing a tall, emaciated figure near their campsite. Apparently, their encounter had been serious enough to affect the camp's operations as well. "What makes you think I can see it when the other kids can't?" "Some people are more sensitive to this kind of thing than others. Usually it's adults who have the strongest reactions, but occasionally a child will be particularly aware of unusual activity. In those cases, we try to provide extra support and monitoring to keep everyone safe." "Extra support like what?" "Well, for starters, I'm going to move you to a different cabin tonight. Cabin 3 is farther from the tree line and has better lighting around the perimeter. I'll also make sure that you're never alone when moving between buildings after dark." "What about Connor and the other boys in Cabin 7? "They'll be fine. Whatever's out there seems to focus its attention on people who can actually perceive it clearly. As long as they continue sleeping through the encounters, they're not at significant risk." I wanted to ask more questions, but Brett indicated that our conversation was over and that we needed to rejoin the group for the morning's scheduled activities. As we walked back toward the main camp area, I felt a confusing mixture of emotions. On one hand, I was relieved to know that I wasn't losing my mind and that responsible adults were aware of the situation. On the other hand, the casual way Brett discussed managing encounters with an unknown entity didn't inspire confidence in the camp's ability to keep us truly safe. That afternoon, during what was supposed to be a rest period, I was moved to Cabin 3 along with my belongings. My new bunkmates were friendly enough. but I could tell that they had been briefed about my adjustment difficulties and instructed to be supportive and inclusive. Brett had clearly crafted a cover story that explained my cabin change without revealing the true reason. As evening approached and we prepared for another night at Cedar Ridge, I found myself hoping that the change of location would be enough to end my encounters with whatever was lurking in the forest. But deep down, I suspected that simply moving to a different cabin wouldn't be sufficient to solve a problem that had been developing for decades. Whatever was out there had taken a specific interest in me, and I doubted that 50 yards of additional distance from the tree line would be enough to discourage its attention. My first night in Cabin 3 started peacefully enough. The building was indeed farther from the forest edge, positioned in the center of the camp complex with better lighting and more activity around it. Brett had assigned me a bunk near the front of the cabin, close to where the counselor slept, and he had made a point of checking on me multiple times during the evening. For the first few hours after lights out, I actually managed to relax somewhat. The normal sounds of settling wood and distant forest noise seemed less threatening in this new environment, and the presence of the counselor so nearby provided a degree of comfort I hadn't felt since arriving at camp. But around 2 a.m., I was awakened by a sound that made my heart skip several beats. Scratching. The same deliberate rhythmic scratching I had heard on the roof of Cabin 7, but this time it was coming from multiple directions simultaneously. Whatever was out there wasn't alone anymore. I lay in my bunk, listening to the sounds of claws or talons scraping against wood and metal from at least 3 different locations around the cabin. The scratching was accompanied by low, guttural sounds that were clearly some form of communication between the entities responsible for the noise. They were coordinating their efforts, working together to achieve some specific goal. The activity continued for about 20 minutes before shifting to a new phase that was even more terrifying. I began to hear the sounds of the entities testing various entry points around the building, rattling door handles, probing window latches, and examining the foundation for weak spots. They were methodical and patient, taking time to thoroughly evaluate each potential avenue of access. When they reached the front door of our cabin, I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. The metal bolt that secured the door from the inside was being manipulated from the outside, sliding slowly but steadily toward the unlocked position. Whatever these things were, they had learned to defeat the simple security measures that protected sleeping campers. I knew I had to wake the counselor, but I was terrified that any movement or sound would draw the entity's attention to my specific location. Instead, I remained motionless and watched through barely opened eyes as the front door of our cabin swung silently open. 3 figures entered our sleeping area, moving with the same careful precision I had witnessed during the previous intrusion. But this time I could see them more clearly due to the better lighting around Cabin 3. What I saw defied every rational explanation my young mind could conceive. The entities were humanoid in general shape, but grotesquely distorted in their proportions. They stood at least 8 feet tall, with skeletal frames that seemed to consist mostly of jutting bones covered by gray, mottled skin. Their arms were disproportionately long, reaching almost to their knees, and their fingers appeared to be nothing more than sharpened bone protrusions. But it was their faces that filled me with the most horror. They had human features, but stretched and elongated beyond any natural possibility. Their eyes were large and completely black, reflecting available light like the eyes of nocturnal animals. Their mouths were filled with teeth that were too numerous and too sharp, creating expressions that suggested intelligence mixed with predatory hunger. The 3 entities moved through our cabin with obvious familiarity, examining each sleeping camper with the same methodical attention I had experienced in Cabin 7. But this time their behavior was different. Instead of simply observing, they seemed to be making selections, pointing at specific boys and communicating in their low, guttural language. When they reached my bunk, all 3 entities stopped and focused their attention on me. I knew immediately that my pretense of sleep wasn't fooling them. They were aware that I could see them clearly and that I understood the danger they represented. For several long minutes, we engaged in a silent standoff, with me trying to remain motionless while they studied me with obvious interest. Finally, one of the entities reached toward me with its skeletal hand, extending those sharpened finger bones until they were just inches from my face. I could smell the odor of decay and wet earth that seemed to emanate from its skin, and I could hear its breathing. That same deep, labored respiration that had become the soundtrack to my nightmares. At the last possible moment, when I was certain that the thing was about to make physical contact, I couldn't maintain my facade any longer. I bolted upright in my bunk and screamed as loudly as I could, hoping to wake everyone in the cabin and scare away the intruders. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The entities recoiled from my sudden movement and vocalizations as if they had been physically burned. They retreated toward the front door with surprising speed, their forms seeming to become less solid and defined as they moved away from the interior lighting. But instead of fleeing the area entirely, they positioned themselves just outside the cabin and began making sounds unlike anything I had ever heard. The guttural communication was replaced by high-pitched wailing that rose and fell in complex patterns, creating a sound that seemed designed to inspire maximum terror and disorientation. My screaming had awakened everyone in the cabin, including the counselor, who immediately turned on all available lights and began checking on each camper. The other boys were confused and frightened by the sudden awakening, but none of them seemed to have any awareness of what had actually transpired. "What's wrong?" the counselor asked as he reached my bunk. "They were in here," I said, pointing toward the front door. "3 of them. They were looking at all of us, and they were going to—" I stopped speaking when I realized that the door was closed and securely bolted from the inside. There was no evidence that anyone or anything had entered our cabin, and no indication that the intrusion I had witnessed had actually occurred. But the wailing from outside continued, growing louder and more complex as additional voices joined the chorus from different locations around the camp. Soon, the entire forest seemed to be alive with the sound of these entities calling to each other, creating a symphony of terror that was impossible to ignore or rationalize away. Other campers in nearby cabins began waking up and adding their own confused voices to the growing chaos. Counselors emerged from their quarters with flashlights, trying to determine the source of the disturbance and restore order to the camp. Brett appeared at our cabin door within minutes, and after a brief conversation with our counselor, he asked to speak with me privately outside. Despite my terror of leaving the relative safety of the building, I followed him to the same quiet area where we had talked that morning. "Tell me exactly what you saw," he said without preamble. I described the entire encounter in detail, from the initial scratching sounds to the final retreat of the entities when I screamed. Brett listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as if my account confirmed information he already possessed. "The wailing is new," he said when I finished. "We've never had them react that aggressively to being detected. Usually they withdraw immediately if they realize someone is awake and aware of their presence." "What does that mean?" "It means the situation is escalating beyond what we normally experience. I need to make some phone calls and probably implement our emergency protocols." As if to emphasize his point, the wailing from the forest suddenly intensified, and we could see flashlight beams moving through the trees as additional entities responded to whatever call had been issued. The sound was so loud and so disturbing that several of the younger campers had begun crying, despite the counselor's efforts to calm and reassure them. "We're evacuating," Brett said firmly. "I'm calling for transportation to pick up all campers first thing in the morning. This has gone beyond what we can safely manage." I felt a mixture of relief and guilt. Relief that we would soon be away from this place and whatever lived in the surrounding forest, but guilt that my inability to remain hidden had apparently triggered a response that was threatening the entire camp operation. "Is this my fault?" I asked. "No," Brett replied without hesitation. "This has been building since the day you arrived. If anything, your awareness of what was happening probably prevented something much worse from occurring." As we returned to the cabin to help with the evacuation preparations, I realized that my summer camp experience was about to end in a way I could never have imagined. But I also understood that I had gained knowledge and experiences that would stay with me for the rest of my life, knowledge about things that existed beyond the comfortable boundaries of normal human understanding. The entities continued their wailing throughout the remainder of the night, creating a constant backdrop of otherworldly sound that made sleep impossible for anyone in the camp. By dawn, their voices had faded back into the forest depths, but the memory of that terrible chorus would haunt my dreams for years to come. The evacuation of Cedar Ridge Summer Camp began at first light, with a convoy of buses and vans arriving to transport 43 campers and 12 staff members back to their respective homes. The official explanation given to parents was an unexpected closure due to severe weather damage and safety concerns, which was technically accurate even if it didn't address the true nature of the threat. As we loaded our belongings onto the buses, I noticed that several of the other campers seemed relieved to be leaving, even though they couldn't articulate why. The events of the previous night had left everyone on edge, and the unnatural silence that had settled over the forest with the dawn felt more ominous than comforting. Connor sat beside me on the bus, but our usual easy conversation was replaced by an uncomfortable silence. I could tell that he wanted to ask questions about what had really happened, but something prevented him from voicing his concerns directly. "Those sounds last night," he said finally, as our bus pulled away from the camp. "They weren't anything normal, were they?" "No," I replied quietly. "They weren't." "Did you see anything? When you woke everyone up screaming?" I considered how much to tell him. Part of me wanted to share the full truth about what I had witnessed, but another part recognized that some knowledge was too disturbing to pass along to someone who hadn't asked for it. "I saw enough to know that we needed to get out of there," I said finally. Connor nodded and didn't press for additional details. As our bus traveled the winding forest roads away from Cedar Ridge, I watched through the rear window until the camp buildings disappeared entirely behind the trees. I had the distinct feeling that I was leaving something unfinished, but I was grateful to be putting distance between myself and whatever lived in those woods. The 3-hour bus ride gave me time to process what I had experienced and to begin formulating how I would explain the early end of my camp session to my parents. I decided to stick close to the official story. Severe weather had damaged some facilities and created unsafe conditions that required immediate evacuation. It wasn't entirely false, and it avoided the need to discuss elements that no rational adult would be likely to believe. When I arrived home that afternoon, my parents were surprised by my early return, but seemed satisfied with my explanation. They assumed that my subdued mood and obvious fatigue were natural reactions to the disappointment of having my camp experience cut short, and they gave me space to readjust to being home without excessive questioning. Over the following weeks, I found myself researching everything I could find about the history of the area around Cedar Ridge. I read accounts of the logging operations that had operated there in the late 1800s, the various camping and recreational facilities that had been established over the years, and the folklore that had developed around unexplained incidents in the region. What I discovered confirmed that my experiences were part of a pattern that stretched back over more than a century. Every few years, when conditions were apparently right, there would be reports of unusual activity in the forest, missing persons, abandoned campsites, encounters with entities that defied conventional explanation. The incidents would cluster over a period of weeks or months, then disappear for years at a time. I also learned that Cedar Ridge Summer Camp had indeed been evacuated twice before during its 32-year history, in 1994 and 2016. In both cases, the official explanation had involved weather-related safety concerns, but local newspaper accounts hinted at more complex circumstances that weren't fully explained to the public. About 6 months after my experience at the camp, I received an unexpected phone call from Brett. He was calling to check on how I was doing and to provide some closure about what had happened during my stay. "The camp won't be reopening," he told me. "The owners have decided that the liability issues have become too significant to continue operations." "What about the things in the forest?" "They're still there, as far as we know. The Department of Natural Resources has expanded the protected area around the former campsite and restricted public access. Officially, it's for environmental conservation purposes." "Do you think they'll ever bother people again?" "Probably. Every few years, when conditions are right, someone will have an encounter. But hopefully future incidents will be isolated and manageable, without putting large groups of people at risk." Brett's call provided some closure, but it also confirmed that I had been part of something much larger and more complex than a simple summer camp experience. I had encountered entities that existed outside normal human understanding, and I had survived that encounter because of a combination of awareness, luck, and the intervention of adults who understood the true nature of the threat. As I grew older and gained more perspective on what had happened to me, I came to understand that there are places in the world where the normal rules of reality don't apply completely. These places exist on the margins of human experience, usually avoided or ignored by people who instinctively recognize their dangerous nature. Cedar Ridge Summer Camp had been built on one of these marginal places, and for 32 years, dedicated staff members had managed to operate there safely, by acknowledging the unusual nature of their environment and taking appropriate precautions. But eventually, the risks had become too great to justify continued operations. Today, the former campsite is overgrown and abandoned, slowly being reclaimed by the forest that surrounds it. The buildings have been removed, and most traces of human habitation have been erased. But sometimes, on quiet nights when conditions are right, hikers in the area report hearing sounds from the forest that can't be easily explained, sounds that remind me of the wailing chorus I heard during my final night at Cedar Ridge. I still think about those entities sometimes, wondering what they are and where they came from. I wonder if they're still there, waiting in the depths of the forest for the next group of unsuspecting visitors to stumble into their territory. And I'm grateful that my encounter with them ended with an evacuation rather than something far worse. The experience taught me that the world contains mysteries that may never be fully understood or explained, and that sometimes the wisest response to such mysteries is simply to acknowledge their existence and maintain a respectful distance. Some places are meant to remain wild and unexplored, and some entities are better left undisturbed in their ancient territories. Cedar Ridge is one of those places, and I have no intention of ever returning to find out what might be waiting there in the shadows between the trees. The trail seemed innocent enough on the map. Just another backcountry route through Blackridge National Forest, a 6-day loop promising solitude and breathtaking vistas. I'd been planning this solo trek for months, ever since my job at the software company went remote. The isolation of constant screen time had driven me to seek something real, something primal. "You sure about going alone?" my coworker Michael had asked during our last video call. "Those northern woods get pretty remote." I dismissed his concerns with practiced confidence. "I've done plenty of weekend hikes. Besides, I've got satellite GPS and emergency beacon. Nothing to worry about." That conversation replayed in my mind as I shouldered my pack at the trailhead on a crisp September morning. The parking lot was deserted except for my rental car, a fact that pleased rather than concerned me. The forest stretched before me, ancient pines standing like sentinels against the pale sky. The air carried the sharp scent of resin and wet earth. The first day's hike was moderate, a gradual 2,000-foot elevation gain over 8 miles. My boots crunched through fallen pine needles, the rhythm hypnotic as I adjusted to the weight of my pack. By early afternoon, patches of mist began threading between the trees, transforming the landscape into something from an old folk tale. I made camp at a small clearing near a stream, moving through the familiar motions of setting up my tent and filtering water. The forest felt alive around me. Birds calling from unseen perches, small creatures rustling in the underbrush. It was exactly what I'd come for. After dinner, I sat beside my small camp stove, sipping instant coffee and watching darkness pool beneath the trees. That's when I heard it. A strange, ululating cry that seemed to skirt the edge between human and animal. I froze, cup halfway to my lips. The sound came again, farther away this time. A coyote, perhaps, or some bird I couldn't identify. Yet something about it raised the hair on my arms. I told myself it was natural to feel uneasy in unfamiliar territory. The wilderness operated on different rules than the sanitized world I'd come from. Sleep came fitfully that night. Each snap of a twig or distant call jolted me awake. Around 3 a.m. I emerged from my tent to relieve myself and paused, struck by the absolute stillness. The forest had gone completely silent. No insects chirping, no nightbirds calling. Even the stream seemed to have hushed its constant murmur. I scanned the trees, my headlamp cutting a weak cone through the darkness. Something reflected the light briefly. 2 points of yellowish gleam about 6 feet off the ground. Then they were gone. "Just an animal," I whispered, my voice sounding thin and unconvincing. The rest of the night passed without incident, though I kept my hunting knife close at hand. When dawn finally broke, I felt foolish for my midnight anxiety. The forest was alive again with birdsong and the rustling of small creatures. I broke camp efficiently, eager to reach the higher elevations where the views would open up. The trail grew steeper, switchbacking up a ridge through increasingly sparse vegetation. By noon, I'd gained enough elevation to look back over the vast wilderness I'd entered. Miles of unbroken forest stretched to the horizon, a dark green sea beneath the overcast sky. It was while taking in this view that I first noticed the footprints. They paralleled my own trail about 20 feet off the path, large, human-like impressions pressing deep into the soft forest floor. They hadn't been there on my ascent. Someone else was out here. That wasn't unusual in itself, but something about those tracks unsettled me. They appeared and disappeared at odd intervals, sometimes visible in patches of mud, then absent where they should have crossed open ground. A rumble of thunder prompted me to continue. The weather report had mentioned possible afternoon storms, and I wanted to reach my planned campsite before they hit. The footprints followed, always keeping pace, always just off trail. I quickened my steps, trying to outpace both the coming storm and my growing unease. The woods seemed to darken prematurely as clouds gathered overhead. When the rain finally came, it arrived in a sudden deluge that forced me to hastily erect my tent in a small clearing. Inside the relative safety of my nylon shelter, I listened to water hammering the rainfly and tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Another hiker, surely, perhaps a forest ranger checking the backcountry. The rain continued for hours. As darkness fell, I strained to hear anything beyond the steady drumming of water. Occasionally, I caught what sounded like movement. Something large, displacing the underbrush, circling my campsite with deliberate, unhurried steps. I clutched my flashlight and knife, telling myself it was just a deer or elk seeking shelter. But deep down, I knew better. Whatever moved out there was watching me with cold, calculating intent, and somehow I sensed it knew that I knew. Dawn broke with reluctant gray light filtering through the canopy. The rain had stopped, but fog clung to the trees, limiting visibility to a few dozen yards. I emerged from my tent to find the ground around my campsite unmarked, no footprints, no signs of disturbance. Yet the uneasy feeling remained, a persistent itch between my shoulder blades. I forced down a breakfast of instant oatmeal and packed quickly, eager to be moving. Today's route would take me along a ridgeline before descending into a valley said to contain one of the oldest growth forests in the region. Under different circumstances, I'd have been excited. The trail narrowed as it climbed, hugging the edge of steep drops that vanished into the fog below. I moved cautiously, one hand often reaching for tree trunks or rocks for balance. The mist created an eerie disconnect, as though the visible world ended just a few feet away. Around midday, the fog began to lift, revealing glimpses of the valley below. I paused at a rocky outcropping to rest and check my map. That's when I noticed the arrangement of stones near my feet. Not a natural formation, but 3 smooth river rocks, balanced in a small pyramid. Someone had placed them there deliberately. A marker left by another hiker? Possibly. But the rocks were dry underneath, meaning they'd been placed after the rain stopped this morning. I scanned the surrounding forest but saw no one. Continuing along the ridge, I began finding more signs. Broken branches positioned to point in unnatural directions, small cairns where no trail markers should be. Each discovery ratcheted my unease higher. Someone was moving through these woods parallel to me, leaving signs I couldn't fully interpret. By mid-afternoon, I began my descent into the valley. The trail switchbacked down through increasingly dense forest, the ancient trees blocking much of the fading daylight. The shifting shadows played tricks on my peripheral vision, darting movements that vanished when I turned to look directly. I found my designated campsite near a small pond. Park regulations required backcountry campers to use established sites, but I almost wished I could push on. Something about this place felt wrong, the water too still, the surrounding trees too watchful. As I set up camp, I discovered a crude figure hanging from a nearby branch, twigs bound together with what looked like animal sinew to form a humanoid shape. My first thought was vandalism, some teenager's idea of a Blair Witch reference, but the craftsmanship suggested something older, more purposeful. I left it untouched and focused on securing my camp before darkness fell. The pond surface reflected the deepening sky, a perfect mirror until ripples suddenly spread across it. I hadn't seen anything break the surface. That night I built a larger fire than necessary, the flames offering both warmth and psychological comfort. The forest sounds seemed normal, frogs croaking near the pond, an occasional owl call, but underneath ran a current of wrongness I couldn't place. I was adding another log to the fire when I saw it, a shape at the forest's edge, tall and impossibly thin. For a moment I thought it was just another tree trunk. Then it moved. My body froze while my mind raced. The figure stood partially hidden behind a large pine, but I could make out a human-like silhouette. It remained perfectly still, watching. I reached slowly for my knife. "Hello?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "I know you're there." No response, no movement, just patient, predatory stillness. I grabbed my flashlight and directed the beam toward the spot, but found only empty forest. Whatever I'd seen had vanished, or never been there at all. Yet the feeling of being observed intensified, pressing against me like a physical weight. Sleep was impossible. I kept the fire burning through the night, listening to the forest and trying to distinguish normal sounds from potential threats. Occasionally, branches would crack in the distance, always from a different direction, as if something was circling my camp. Shortly before dawn, I dozed off despite my intentions to remain alert. I awoke with a jolt to find my fire reduced to embers and something placed at the edge of my campsite, a freshly killed rabbit, its neck broken and body arranged with unnatural precision. The message was clear. While I slept, something had approached close enough to leave this offering. I abandoned any pretense of normal camping routine, hastily packing my essential gear and leaving the rest behind. My only thought was to reach the ranger station marked on my map, about 15 miles ahead. As I shouldered my lightened pack, movement caught my eye, something large passing between distant trees. The glimpse was too brief to identify, but the impression lingered. A figure walking upright but moving with animal fluidity, its outline somehow wrong against the morning light. I took one last look at my abandoned campsite and the grotesque gift left for me. Then I ran. The trail descended through stands of ancient hemlock, their massive trunks creating a labyrinth of shadows. I moved as quickly as safety allowed, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The heavy silence of the forest pressed against my ears. No birdsong, no rustling of small creatures. Everything was holding its breath. According to my map, the trail should intersect with a fire road about 7 miles ahead. From there, I might encounter other hikers or forestry workers. The thought spurred me on despite my burning lungs and aching legs. Around noon, I paused beside a small stream to refill my water bottle. As I crouched at the water's edge, something caught my attention, a reflection in the clear surface that didn't match the surroundings. I jerked upright, scanning the opposite bank. Nothing visible, but the sense of being watched intensified. I abandoned the water and pushed on, the back of my neck prickling with awareness of unseen eyes. The forest gradually changed character, the old growth giving way to younger trees with dense undergrowth. The trail narrowed, forcing me to push through shoulder-high ferns that limited visibility to a few feet ahead. Each step became an act of faith, each turn revealing only more green tunnel. I was fighting through a particularly thick section when I found the first trap. A nearly invisible line of braided animal sinew stretched across the path at ankle height. Had I been moving at my earlier pace, I would have tripped directly into a bed of sharpened sticks, positioned to impale whatever fell upon them. My blood turned to ice water. This wasn't some forest predator or territorial animal. This was calculated human malevolence. I carefully stepped over the trap and continued with heightened caution, scanning the ground before each step. 2 more traps appeared in the next mile. One a pit disguised with a covering of branches and leaves, another a deadfall triggered by a tripwire. Who would set such things in a national forest? My mind recalled stories of hermits and isolationists who sometimes claimed wilderness territories as their own, attacking those they considered trespassers. But these traps felt different, not the work of someone trying to keep people away, but of someone herding me in a specific direction. By mid-afternoon, I realized I'd lost the official trail. The path I was following appeared well used but didn't match my map. Had I missed a turn, or had I been deliberately led astray? The canopy had thickened again, making it impossible to get my bearings from the sun. I came to a small clearing and stopped to check my GPS device. Dead. The battery had been nearly full that morning. My phone showed no signal, as expected, but its compass app still functioned. According to the digital needle, I was heading northwest, away from the ranger station. Anxiety threatened to overwhelm me. I forced myself to breathe deeply and think logically. The fire road should lie directly east. I would forge my own path if necessary. As I turned to leave the clearing, I spotted something that froze the breath in my lungs, a crude structure hidden among the trees at the far edge. At first glance, it resembled a hunting blind, but closer inspection revealed something more disturbing. The small shelter was constructed of interwoven branches and animal hides stretched over a frame of lashed-together saplings. Bones hung from the edges, small mammals and birds mostly, but some larger specimens I couldn't identify. The entrance gaped like a black mouth, revealing nothing of the interior. I approached cautiously, every instinct screaming to run in the opposite direction. A nauseating smell emanated from the structure, the metallic scent of blood mixed with something musky and feral. Just outside the entrance lay a collection of items that stopped me cold. A broken compass, the shredded remains of a hiking boot, a twisted frame of what might once have been a backpack, trophies, or warnings, a sound behind me, the snap of a twig, deliberate and close. I spun around to face empty forest, then heard it again, from a different direction. My pursuer was toying with me. I backed away from the shelter, trying to maintain awareness in all directions. Another snap, closer still, then silence, more terrifying than any noise could be. The attack, when it came, was nearly silent. A rush of movement from my left, a dark shape hurtling through the undergrowth. I caught a glimpse of something wearing what looked like animal furs, moving with a terrible, loping speed. I ran blindly, crashing through brush and branches, aware of pursuit behind me. My foot caught on an exposed root, sending me sprawling. As I scrambled to rise, I caught sight of my pursuer for the first time. The figure stood about 20 yards away, partially concealed by a tree trunk. Its form was human-shaped but wrong somehow, too angular, joints bending in unnatural ways. It wore what appeared to be a crudely stitched covering of animal pelts and a headdress that incorporated antlers or bones. The face remained in shadow, but I could feel its gaze with physical intensity. For several heartbeats, neither of us moved. Then it raised one hand in a gesture that might have been greeting or threat. I didn't wait to find out which. I ran again, no longer caring about direction or stealth, driven by pure survival instinct. Branches whipped my face, thorns tore at my clothing. Behind me came sounds of pursuit, not directly behind, but paralleling my course, sometimes drawing closer, sometimes falling back. I realized with growing horror that I was being herded, driven in a specific direction by an intelligence that knew these woods intimately. Each time I tried to veer eastward, the sounds of pursuit intensified, forcing me back on a northerly course. The forest began to thin, and ahead I glimpsed what appeared to be the edge of a cliff or steep drop-off. The pursuing sounds converged from both sides now, leaving me only one direction, forward. I burst from the tree line onto a rocky ledge overlooking a river gorge, perhaps 100 feet below. The water looked distant and unreachable, white rapids threading between sharp rocks. I turned to face the forest, knife in hand, back to the precipice. The trees remained still and silent. Nothing emerged. After long minutes, I began to wonder if I'd imagined the pursuit entirely. As the adrenaline ebbed, rational thought returned. I checked my compass again. The gorge ran roughly east-west. If I could find a way down to the river, it might lead me to civilization. Rivers always do. I moved carefully along the ledge, searching for a descent route. As I did, something caught my eye on a rock near the cliff edge, fresh claw marks, deep and deliberate, forming a crude symbol I didn't recognize, a message or a claim, and the certainty that whatever hunted me was far from finished. The gorge stretched before me with no visible path down. I followed the ridgeline eastward as afternoon light began to fade, hoping to find a break in the cliff face. My pursuer remained hidden, but occasional sounds from the forest confirmed its continuing presence, patient, monitoring, waiting for darkness. After 2 miles of increasingly difficult terrain, I found what I was looking for. A steep but manageable descent, where a landslide had created a rough natural staircase to the river below. I began picking my way down, testing each foothold before committing my weight. The river roared louder as I descended, its voice drowning out any sounds of pursuit. This bothered me more than it should have, at least before I'd had some awareness of the creature's location. Now I felt blind, vulnerable. By the time I reached the river's edge, dusk was settling over the gorge. The water moved too swiftly for safe crossing, but a narrow game trail followed the bank heading downstream. I took it, moving as quickly as the fading light allowed. The walls of the gorge loomed on either side, cutting off the last daylight and plunging the river into premature night. I activated my flashlight, knowing it made me visible but having no choice if I wanted to avoid a fatal misstep. The trail occasionally vanished, forcing me to climb over boulder fields or wade through shallow sections of the river. My boots and pants became soaked, adding to my misery as temperature dropped with nightfall. Around what I estimated to be midnight, I came upon a natural alcove in the canyon wall, a shallow cave offering some shelter from the increasing wind. Exhaustion overwhelmed caution, and I decided to rest. The cave's narrow entrance would at least prevent anything from approaching unseen. I huddled against the back wall, facing the entrance with my knife and flashlight ready. Outside, the river's constant voice masked other sounds. The darkness beyond my small circle of light seemed absolute. Sleep came in fitful bursts, each awakening bringing momentary panic. During one such episode, I became aware of a change. The cave seemed darker. I raised my flashlight to find the entrance partially blocked by a crude arrangement of branches and rocks, clearly placed there while I'd slept. My heart hammered against my ribs. I hadn't heard a thing over the river's noise. Whatever stalked me had approached close enough to begin sealing me in, and might still be just outside. I moved to the entrance and cautiously pushed aside the barricade. The night beyond appeared empty, but the absolute certainty of being watched settled over me like a physical weight. Sleep was no longer an option. I spent the remaining hours until dawn in a state of hypervigilance, jumping at every shift of shadow or change in the river's voice. Sometime before morning, a scraping sound came from the roof of the cave, something moving across the rock above me. When first light finally came, I emerged cautiously to find fresh tracks in the mud near the entrance. Not quite human, not quite animal. The impressions were deep, as if made by something heavier than its size would suggest. They approached the cave directly, then circled around to the side where a path led up to the top of the alcove. I didn't wait to see what other signs morning might reveal. I continued downstream, moving faster now with improved visibility. The gorge gradually widened, the walls becoming less steep. By mid-morning, I found what looked like an old logging road intersecting the river at a shallow ford. The road was overgrown but still visible, heading east through thinning forest. Hope surged for the first time in days. I pushed on with renewed energy, following the dirt track as it wound through stands of younger trees and occasional clearings. Around noon, I found the first sign of human presence. An old fire ring with relatively recent ashes. Someone had camped here within the past week. I searched the site thoroughly, finding a discarded energy bar wrapper with part of a manufacturing date still visible. Recent. The road improved as I continued, showing occasional tire tracks and muddy sections. By late afternoon, I spotted a structure through the trees, an old fire lookout tower standing on a cleared hilltop. I approached cautiously, years of wilderness experience warring with desperate need for help. The tower appeared maintained but currently unmanned, its metal stairs leading up to a small cabin perhaps 40 feet above ground. The door at the base of the stairs was unlocked. A sign indicated the tower was open to hikers during daylight hours but not for overnight use. I ignored this directive and climbed quickly, wanting height and visibility more than anything else. The cabin at the top was small but well equipped. A desk with radio equipment, maps on the walls, basic emergency supplies. Most importantly, it offered 360-degree views of the surrounding forest. I tried the radio immediately, but received only static across all frequencies. A logbook on the desk showed the tower was checked weekly during fire season, with the last entry dated just 3 days ago. Help would come, if I could just hold out. As afternoon faded toward evening, I scanned the forest edge with obsessive regularity. For hours, nothing moved except wind-blown branches. Then, as sunset painted the western sky in bloody streaks, I spotted it, a figure emerging from the tree line directly below the tower. Through binoculars found in the cabin, I finally saw my pursuer clearly. The sight defied easy description. A human form, certainly, but moved with an unnatural, jerking gait. It wore a covering made from multiple animal hides stitched together, and a headdress incorporating a deer skull with antlers intact. Where its face should have been visible beneath this grotesque helmet, there was only shadow. It stopped at the edge of the clearing, staring up at the tower. Even from 40 feet above, I felt pinned by that invisible gaze. It raised one arm in that same ambiguous gesture I'd seen before, then deliberately walked the perimeter of the clearing, never taking its attention from the tower. I watched, transfixed, as it completed a full circuit, then returned to its starting point. There it began what I can only describe as a ritual, moving in patterns that seemed both random and precisely calculated, occasionally stopping to scrape marks in the earth or arrange small objects it carried. As darkness fell, I lost sight of the figure, but could hear activity continuing below, scraping sounds, the crack of breaking branches, something being dragged across the ground. I kept all lights off, not wanting to silhouette myself in the windows. Around midnight, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any noise, an expectant, predatory hush. I strained to hear anything over the pounding of my own heart. The first impact against the tower's base came without warning, a heavy, deliberate thud that vibrated through the metal framework, then another, and another. Not random attacks, but rhythmic like a slow heartbeat, testing the structure, or sending a message. The impacts continued for perhaps 20 minutes, then ceased. In the silence that followed, I heard a new sound, the distinctive creak of weight on the metal stairs. Step by step, methodical and unhurried, something was ascending toward the cabin. I braced a chair against the hatch that served as the cabin's only entrance, then retreated to the far side, knife in hand. The creaking progress continued until it reached the top. The hatch handle turned, found resistance, then stopped. Silence again, stretching interminably. Then a scraping directly against the outside wall of the cabin, something circling the small structure, testing each wall, each window. Occasionally, a shadow would pass across the glass, blocking the faint starlight. This psychological siege continued through the night. Periods of activity, followed by unnerving silence, then renewed attempts to find weakness in my refuge. I remained motionless, conserving energy, mind oscillating between terror and a strange, detached analysis of my situation. As pre-dawn light began to filter through the trees, the presence withdrew. I heard its descent on the metal stairs, then watched through binoculars as it crossed the clearing toward the forest edge. At the tree line, it turned for one final look at the tower. In daylight, what I saw made no logical sense. The figure's proportions seemed to shift as it moved, its silhouette changing subtly against the dark trees. It raised both arms in a gesture that might have been supplication or threat, then slipped into the forest and was gone. But it had left something behind. In the center of the clearing, visible now in growing daylight, was an arrangement that turned my blood to ice. My own discarded gear from the abandoned campsite, arranged in a crude human shape. A message, unmistakable in its intent. You are not escaping. The day passed in tense vigilance. I searched the tower thoroughly, looking for anything that might help my situation. The emergency supplies included water purification tablets, some preserved food, a first aid kit, and a flare gun with 3 rounds. The radio remained stubbornly silent, despite my repeated attempts across all frequencies. Most valuable was a detailed topographical map covering the entire region. I located the tower's position and traced potential routes to civilization. The nearest ranger station was approximately 18 miles east, but the terrain between looked challenging, a series of ridges and valleys with few established trails. More concerning was what I found in the tower's logbook. Between mundane entries about weather conditions and fire risk, I discovered a pattern, references to unusual activity and unexplained sightings, stretching back several seasons. The most recent entry, from just 3 days ago, included a cryptic note. Found more structures in North Quadrant. Reported to HQ. No response yet. As afternoon waned, I faced a difficult decision. The logbook indicated the next scheduled check wouldn't happen for 4 days. Could I last that long under siege? Or should I attempt to reach help on my own? The creature's behavior suggested it was playing a calculated game. It could have attacked directly many times, but chose psychological warfare instead. This realization didn't comfort me. Whatever hunted me was intelligent, patient, and intimately familiar with these woods. I decided to leave at first light. Remaining meant eventual dehydration or starvation if help didn't arrive. At least movement offered some chance, however slim. That night passed in similar fashion to the previous one. Intermittent testing of the tower's structure, occasional ascents of the staircase, and that same unnerving circling of the cabin. I didn't sleep, but conserved energy and planned my route for morning. Dawn came with unexpected fog, thick white mist that limited visibility to a few dozen yards. It wasn't ideal for navigation, but provided cover I desperately needed. I packed what supplies I could carry from the tower, including the flare gun, and descended cautiously, scanning constantly for movement in the surrounding whiteness. The clearing seemed abandoned, but the arrangement of my gear remained in the center, a grotesque scarecrow marking what felt increasingly like my own grave. I skirted it widely and headed east, compass in hand. The fog muffled sound and distorted distance, transforming the forest into an alien landscape. I moved as quietly as possible, stopping frequently to listen for pursuit. For the first hour, I detected nothing unusual, just the drip of condensation from leaves and the occasional call of a bird. By mid-morning, the fog began to lift, revealing a landscape of steep ridges and narrow valleys. I maintained my eastward heading, sometimes having to detour around impassable terrain, but always returning to my chosen direction. Around noon, I found the first sign that I was being followed, a crude marker fashioned from twisted branches pointing in the direction I had just come from. It hadn't been there when I passed earlier. My pursuer was not only tracking me, but moving ahead to leave these taunting signs. I quickened my pace despite growing fatigue. The terrain grew increasingly difficult, loose shale slopes that threatened to send me sliding, thick understory that clutched at my legs, stream crossings where the water ran swift and cold. By late afternoon, I reached the base of a particularly steep ridge. According to my map, once over this obstacle, the land would gradually descend toward the ranger station. I began the climb, muscles protesting after days of constant exertion and minimal rest. Near the summit, I found another marker, this one more elaborate. A small collection of bones arranged in a spiral pattern, with a central space containing what looked disturbingly like a human molar. I forced myself not to think about its origin. The ridge top offered a momentary sense of achievement. Below stretched a valley that eventually opened onto what appeared to be logged areas, signs of human activity. Perhaps 3 or 4 hours of travel, if I maintained my pace. I had just started my descent when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong in any natural forest. A rhythmic clicking, like bone striking bone, emanating from the ridgeline behind me. I didn't turn to look. I ran. The downslope was treacherous, loose rocks and exposed roots threatening to send me tumbling. I abandoned caution for speed, using trees to break my descent where possible. The clicking sound continued, sometimes fading, sometimes growing louder, but always present. At the valley floor, I encountered a small stream and followed it eastward. The banks were overgrown but provided clear direction. As twilight approached, I faced the reality that I wouldn't reach civilization before dark. I needed shelter, somewhere defensible to wait out the night. The stream had carved a small ravine in places, with undercut banks and exposed root systems of large trees. One such hollow looked promising, a cavity beneath a massive old-growth evergreen, partially screened by fallen branches. I crawled inside and arranged the branches to better conceal the entrance. The space was cramped but offered good visibility of the approaching streambed while hiding me from casual observation. Darkness fell with the suddenness particular to forests. I didn't dare use my flashlight, instead relying on increasingly dilated pupils to make out shapes in the gloom. The stream's gentle voice provided some cover for small movements, but also masked sounds of approach. I don't know exactly when I became aware of the presence. There was no sound, no visual cue, just an absolute certainty that something waited nearby. I controlled my breathing, trying not to make the slightest noise, while straining to detect movement in the darkness. A soft scraping sound came from directly above, something moving across the top of my shelter. Dirt and small debris filtered down through the roots forming my ceiling. The weight moved methodically, testing different sections of the ground above. I clutched the flare gun, considering my options. Firing would reveal my position absolutely, but might drive the creature away temporarily. Or it might provoke a direct attack. I decided to wait. Hours passed in this suspended state, the presence above occasionally shifting position but never leaving. Once, a small object dropped through the roots and landed beside me. A carved wooden figure, humanoid but with exaggerated limbs and an animal-like head. A calling card, left deliberately. Shortly before dawn, the heaviness above receded. I remained motionless, suspecting a trap. When faint light finally began filtering through the trees, I cautiously emerged, every sense alert for danger. The stream bed appeared empty in both directions. On the ground above my shelter, I found disturbed earth and a clear impression, as if something heavy had lain there through the night, watching, waiting, perhaps listening to my terrified heartbeat just inches below. I resumed my eastward journey immediately, following the stream as it widened and joined a larger waterway. The forest began showing signs of human management, younger stands of trees in regular patterns, occasional cut stumps, and finally a narrow dirt road paralleling the water. Hope surged. I increased my pace despite exhaustion. The road gradually improved, showing tire tracks and eventually widening enough for vehicle passage. By mid-morning I spotted what looked like a building through the trees ahead. I approached cautiously, having learned harsh lessons about false security. It was an old logging shed or equipment storage, abandoned but relatively intact. No vehicle was present, but boot prints in the mud suggested recent human visitation. Inside I found basic tools, some empty fuel containers, and, most precious, a two-way radio on a shelf. I activated it with trembling hands and was rewarded with the crackle of static. I cycled through channels until I found one with audible voices, then pressed the transmit button. Emergency. Hiker in distress. Located at old logging shed east of Blackridge Valley. Being pursued. Need immediate assistance. The response was immediate but broken. Signal fading in and out. Copy that. Location again. Sending. Stay put. Relief nearly overwhelmed me. Help was coming. I just needed to hold out. I secured the shed as best I could, using tools to reinforce the single door and small window. Then I took up position where I could watch the approach from the forest while maintaining access to the radio. As afternoon stretched toward evening, a new sound reached me, the distant but unmistakable drone of a vehicle engine. I almost wept with relief. But as the sound grew closer, another awareness dawned. A presence in the forest edge opposite the road. A figure partially concealed by shadows, watching the shed with unnerving stillness. The antlered silhouette was unmistakable. We both heard the approaching vehicle. The figure made no move to retreat, instead stepping partially into clearer view. For the first time, I witnessed a display that seemed like genuine emotion, a posture of rage or defiance directed not at me, but at the approaching intrusion. The creature turned its antlered head toward me one final time. Even without seeing its face, I understood the message. This isn't over. Then it was gone, melting into the forest with unnatural speed just as headlights appeared on the access road. The forestry service truck pulled up outside the shed, and two uniformed rangers emerged, looking concerned and confused. I stumbled outside, babbling my story in disconnected fragments. They exchanged glances I couldn't interpret, then helped me into their vehicle. As we drove away, I kept my eyes fixed on the darkening forest edge, certain that somewhere in those shadows, patient yellow eyes were watching, waiting. The threat had retreated, but not disappeared. And deep down, I knew with terrible certainty that the wilderness held secrets most of us are never meant to uncover. Territories where the line between predator and prey, between human and other, blurs into meaninglessness. Some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed. Some watchers aren't meant to be seen. The rangers took me to a small outpost where I gave a formal statement. Their reactions ranged from professional concern to poorly concealed skepticism. They documented my injuries, the condition of my equipment, and took detailed notes about my encounter locations. One of them, an older man with weathered features, asked fewer questions but watched me with unsettling intensity. When I finished my account, the younger ranger left to make some calls. The older one, Ranger Blackburn according to his nameplate, remained behind. "Not the first report we've had," he said quietly once we were alone. "Not even the 10th. I stared at him, processing the implications. Official position is cougar activity, maybe bears, territorial behaviors misinterpreted by exhausted hikers. He shrugged. Paperwork's easier that way. But you don't believe that, I said. He studied me for a long moment. 26 years in these forests. Seen things that don't fit neat explanations. Tracks that change character mid-stride. Structures no local would build. Hunters gone missing where they shouldn't. Why don't you warn people? About what exactly? Warn them that the most remote sections of wilderness might contain something that doesn't appear in any wildlife manual? He shook his head. Tourism board would love that. The conversation ended when the younger ranger returned. I was transported to the nearest hospital for treatment of dehydration, exposure, and various minor injuries. The doctors were professional but distant, clearly attributing my psychological state to trauma and exhaustion. I was released after 2 days and gave additional statements to local police and Forest Service officials. My account was recorded, filed, and effectively buried. The official report cited an unfortunate combination of poor preparation, navigation errors, and wildlife encounters. I returned home to concerned friends and a backlog of work emails. Superficially, life resumed its normal rhythm. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. Sleep became my enemy. Each night brought dreams of being pursued through endless forests by a patient, calculating presence. I would wake gasping, certain something was watching from the darkened corners of my bedroom. Rational thought provided no defense against these visceral reactions. I researched obsessively, spending hours scouring internet forums and obscure anthropological journals. Reports existed, scattered, often ridiculed, but showing disturbing consistencies, encounters in remote areas with figures described as wearing animal hides and antlers or horns, unexplained structures deep in wilderness areas, patterns of stalking behavior lasting days. Most accounts ended with the person escaping to civilization. A few ended differently, discovered only as brief mentions in missing persons databases or local newspaper archives. 3 weeks after my return, a small package arrived at my apartment. No return address, postmarked from the small town nearest to Blackridge Forest. Inside was a folded note and a small wooden carving, identical to the one dropped into my shelter that final night. The note, written in cramped handwriting, contained just 3 lines. Boundary crossed. Recognition established. It remembers your scent. It knows where you live. I moved the following week, changing my name and leaving no forwarding address. I abandoned social media and cut ties with anyone connected to my previous life. Some might call it paranoia. I consider it survival. I live now in a small apartment in a crowded city, as far from wilderness as I can manage. Yet sometimes, catching a glimpse of parkland trees from my window, I feel that familiar prickle between my shoulder blades, the certainty of being observed by patient, calculating eyes. Most disturbing are the small signs, arranged twigs on my windowsill, unaccountable scratching at my door in the dead of night, the occasional glimpse of an antlered silhouette reflected in windows of buildings across the street. Boundaries mean nothing to it. Distance is merely an inconvenience. Civilization offers the illusion of protection, nothing more. I write this account not as warning. Those who need warning won't recognize the danger until too late, but as testimony. Something ancient and other shares our world, dwelling in the diminishing spaces between human territories. It watches from forest shadows, learning our patterns, testing our defenses. And sometimes when it finds a human who strays too far into its domain, it follows them home. Listen carefully tonight. That sound, branches against your window, or fingers. That shadow, just clothes hanging in your closet, or something watching, waiting. Some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed. Some watchers aren't meant to be seen. And some pursuits never truly end. The warm glow of the setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, as I, Jake Thompson, sat on my porch scrolling through my phone. It was a Friday evening in early October, and the crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant bonfires. I had just finished a long week at the local high school where I taught history, and I was looking forward to a relaxing weekend. As I mindlessly scrolled through my social media feed, a news article caught my eye. Experienced hiker vanishes without a trace in Huckleberry Swamp Nature Area. The headline sent a chill down my spine despite the lingering warmth of the day. Huckleberry Swamp was less than an hour's drive from my home in Hartford, Connecticut, and I had hiked there numerous times over the years. Curiosity piqued, I tapped on the article and began to read. The missing hiker, identified as 42-year-old Martin Greaves, had last been seen entering the nature area 2 weeks ago. Despite extensive search efforts by local authorities and volunteers, no trace of him had been found. The article mentioned that Greaves was an experienced outdoorsman who had hiked challenging trails all over the country. "Hey Jake, Tyrese and I were thinking about doing a night hike tomorrow. You in?" I hesitated for a moment, my eyes darting back to the article about the missing hiker. A part of me wanted to mention it to Marcella, but another part dismissed the thought. After all, people went missing in the wilderness all the time, right? It was probably just a coincidence that it happened so close to home. As I continued reading, my phone buzzed with an incoming text message. It was from my friend Marcella Quinn, a vivacious 28-year-old librarian I had met at a local book club a few years back.